right. I am back with our returning guest, Brent Lengel, for the second half of what we playfully call in the alien versus predator debate on economics between David D. Friedman, the son of Milton and Rose Friedman, and a hardcore advocate of Chicago school economics, the kind that was imposed on Chile in the 70s, and then Walter Block, who is a hardcore advocate of Austrian style economics, which of course many people on the left, hear those and they sound indistinguishable. But I think if we learned nothing else from part one, it's that whereas many of the things that are wrong with Austrian are also wrong with Chicago, Austrian, as it turns out, is much crazier.
A lot crazier. It's not a surprise. I made this joke the other day, the last one, where I said, do you want the economic school that worked for a fascist government, or do you want the economic school that worked for a fascist government? Von Mises famously worked for the fascist Austrian government before World War II, and praised fascism as the savior of Europe. Though he did go on to say that you shouldn't keep doing fascism, just use it to stop the left. Then of course the Chicago school worked with Pinochet.
Yeah, so I should say, like, the fascism thing I'm familiar with von Mises is okay. All right, no, fair enough. You're totally right. I was about to be charitable here for a second, and I looked it up, and that is absolutely correct. So
I love that you fact checked me in real time. That shows that you're being responsible with the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, that sounded like, oh, come on, that's surely an ad. Oh, no, there we go. Which is funny, too, because people have, people will, people like von Mises people will, have all these like lines for defending his praise of Mussolini, earlier than that. And they'll say, oh, well, this is this like sort of in passing thing, whatever. They totally do not mention this. So that's funny.
Yeah. To be fair, like he did say that, like, if you continued doing fascism after the left was stopped, like that would be a fatal error. And that's usually what they'll jump to with that. Von Mises also, interestingly enough, famously said that it was of no consequence that women were denied the right to vote because this was a factor of their social character. And so, or like gendered character or something. So yeah, like freedom, really, it's a lot of the time that their idea of freedom in my mind is more license than actual freedom, because they don't extend it to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, what they mostly mean by freedom is the freedom of, the freedom of business owners to do whatever they want, without like checks to their behavior to, workers and consumers. And, if you want to say that's a kind of freedom, then like, I'm not going to fight you on that. I mean, like if you're, anytime we're arguing about whether people should be able to do something or other, right? Like that's a, there's a way of using, there's a way of coherently slicing up the concepts that, you can call that a kind of freedom, but like, I certainly don't think it's the most important kind, or the most valuable. Like, I mean, that's like, because you could, not that I'm saying these are the same thing, but I mean, just to make the conceptual point, like, look, I mean, in a certain sense, right? I mean, if slavery exists, slave owners are free to do things that they're not, if slavery doesn't exist. But like, that's not a kind of freedom I'm gonna cry over, when it goes away. Even when those nice people in Gone with the Wind, like had such a hard time, after the war, I'm still not going to be sad about it. So, I think there's a, structurally, like there's something similar going on there.
Rothbard, by the way, famously, just to get into this. So Rothbard, by the way, was, because you brought up like slave owners in the Civil War, was a notorious neo-Confederate. And in one of his speeches that he gave, I think, to a group of neo-Confederates, he said that he wanted, like, he really harped on Sherman and, called him a genocidal monster. But it wasn't even like, oh, let's tear up all of these people's. He literally wanted, like, the statues of Sherman torn down, the war songs burned, and replace them with Jefferson Davis and other Confederate heroes. So, it wasn't a surprise that later in his life he went on to endorse David Duke for president.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that.
Are you fact checking me again?
No, I actually am, because like I like not so much because I wanted to, like, it was so important that that like get this right in the moment, but just because, like, I always like to, like, store up my, like, creepy little details about, like, all of the, like, awful fascist positions that people had, and I wanted to make sure I was getting this right for the future. So yeah, that's interesting.
I don't, I may have misspoken. You can, because I don't know if he went so far as to endorse him for president, but he did lament David Duke being defeated when he was making a presidential bid. So I'm not sure about that. I would assume if he's going to say that, he's also going to endorse him, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, you could be right. I will say that what I find on a quick search is a bunch of sources that say that he had positive things to say about David Duke. I see a quote here. Regarding the political program of former Grand Wizard David Duke, Rothbard asserted that nothing in it that could not also asserted that there was nothing in it that could not also be embraced by paleo-conservatives or paleo-libertarians. Lower taxes, dismantling the bureaucracy, slashing the welfare system, attacking affirmative action, racial set-asides, and calling for equal rights for all Americans, including whites. So it does say that he definitely did support the presidential campaign of Pat Buchanan in 1992, which if not quite as bad as David Duke, is like, I think some people might not quite remember this because it's 1992, but it's pretty bad.
Well, like, Dave, if I'm not mistaken, there is a phenomenal episode about Pat Buchanan on Behind the Bastards with Robert Evans. It goes in, it does a deep dive on that, and he was a scary individual. So I was too young at the time, so he just kind of, I thought of him sort of as just like an old Republican fogey, and then I found out about, like, some of the more insidious things that he was interested in. I was like, ooh. Okay, there's that. Go watch Behind the Bastards at some point if you. I cannot recommend that podcast highly enough.
Yeah, I've heard good things about it. I mean, so Pat Buchanan, like, I believe, if I'm remembering right, his convention speech, because he obviously lost the Republican nomination, to the incumbent, George H.W. Bush, but, like, if I'm remembering this right, his Pat Buchanan's convention speech in 1992 was, like, bad enough that, like, some observers thought that it was, like, a big factor in Bill Clinton winning that election. That it had, like, kind of, grossed everybody out so much. Like I remember the Molly Ivins had this line about how she was sure that Buchanan's speech sounded better in the original German.
That's great. It's surprising to me, honestly, because thinking back to, like, the 90s era Republicans, it seemed that some of them had principles, unlike now. Like, I think part of the reason they lost their minds as a party was actually the Clintonite approach, where they campaigned against radical Republicans while simultaneously co-opting some of their ideas. And so the way that the Republicans dealt with this was just running harder and harder to the right until we get, well, what we have now. The problem with, yes.
Yeah, that is, I think we have to say, one of the leading problems with fascism. This is actually true too. I vaguely remember this at the time, as bizarre as it is to think about now, that in 2000, when Pat Buchanan ultimately got the Reform Party nomination, which Trump was sort of a candidate for, he I don't know how far it got, whether it was still officially exploratory or whatever, but he was speaking loosely. He was a candidate at one point, for the Reform Party nomination in 2000, which is bizarre to think about already, right? The guy who's president of the United States for the last 4 years also ran for the Reform Party nomination in 2000. But I think I remember that Trump actually said, Trump actually made some disapproving comments about Buchanan's campaign, that he was too racist and
not just Buchanan. He also denounced David Duke, and then later in 2016 pretended he didn't know who David Duke was.
Yes, he never. Well, especially the 2016 thing was especially good because what the interviewer actually said was David Duke and the KKK have supported you. And he was like, well, I'm not familiar. I'd have to look into, it's okay, all right, it's bad enough to pretend that David Duke, who you've talked about many times in the past, that you're going to pretend you don't know who David Duke is, but you're an adult in America and you don't know what the KKK is.
Yeah. Well, fun fact, he definitely would have known what the KKK was because his father was arrested marching with the KKK in New York.
Yeah. And I believe also, that the first time Donald Trump's name was in the New York Times was when his father, Fred Trump, the guy who was arrested at the Klan rally, was being sued for racial housing discrimination by the federal government, and Donald's name came up as part of the story on the lawsuit because he was very involved in his father's business organization.
Mm-hmm.
So Fred Trump is the one that Woody Guthrie actually wrote a song denouncing. It's called Mr. Trump or something.
Indeed. Woody Guthrie has a number of amazing songs. Tear the Fascists Down is one of my favorites, as is Harama Valley.
Yeah. But, all you fascists gonna lose. Which is...
All you fascists bound to lose.
All you fascists bound to lose. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Yep.
I'm fact checking you now, Ben.
Yeah, fair enough. There's this list that goes around sometimes, this photo of this handwritten list of Woody Guthrie New Year's resolutions. It's from 1942 or something. It's definitely during World War II. And it's great because most of it is just very petty personal things that somebody might want to work on. It's a lot of it's about hygiene, but then so it's it's kind of clip your nails more, blah, blah, blah. And then one of them is defeat fascism.
That's awesome.
Well, on a completely unrelated subject, we should go back.
We should jump back into this debate. I'm really looking forward to this. I had so much fun last week, and when we're done, if you guys are watching this and didn't watch the one, go and watch the one last week. It is amazing.
Yeah. So to recap quickly, do the last week on Battlestar Galactica thing. That's an incredibly dated reference, but whatever. It's what's in my head. Last week on Thursday night debate breakdown, the part of the debate that we watched started off with Walter Block, who is I think that it would be fair to say, and I cannot imagine anybody pushing back too hard about this, a delightfully strange person, giving this opening presentation where he was rambling about philosophy and economics and this very disorganized jumble that involved a lot of drawing things in MS Paint. And a lot of it was about whether there are synthetic a priori truths in economics. In other words, This is something that like rationalists and empiricists, like argued about in early modern philosophy, whether there can be synthetic a priori truths. In other words, truths that tell us something substantive about how reality is, but you could figure out just by thinking about them. You don't have to have evidence. And, maybe, right? I mean, that's a huge philosophical question. I'm not going to, try to rule on that, right? But like, I think it's safe to say that it's beyond insane to think that there are synthetic a priori truths about economics, which is the thing that he was arguing. That there are
It's also so weird because the Austrians argue that the reason they can't, you have to use these synthetic a priori truths is that human behavior is so complicated. It's just so complicated. We just don't want to think about it. So let's just go down via a line of deduction. And David Friedman rightly pointed out that oftentimes if you go and actually try to find evidence for your work, you come to a better understanding, even if you still think you're right, than you would have had you not gone on that search for evidence. The act of trying to back up your supposition, your hypothesis with actual real world research is basically all around a good thing, even if you never change your position. And I actually really liked that and really appreciated that he brought that point out.
Yeah, I mean, methodologically, which is, quite a bit of what they were arguing about, like really most of it, like Friedman, who, we've both debated and I think he is wrong about many, many more things than he's right about. But and I would, look, I would regard, Friedman's utopia, which to be fair is basically the same thing as Bloch's utopia. I think they actually pretty much agree on the normative political program as a pretty extreme dystopia. But like on the methodological thing they were arguing about, like Friedman is just right. Like that, like, yeah, obviously there aren't synthetic a priori truths in economics. Obviously you do have to check some of this stuff to see if it's true. That like, sure, maybe at certain points, something sounds plausible, like, we can't directly test it, whatever, but like as much as possible, you should try to check, to see if what you're saying is true. And in that, and the best thing is, we should say, in the beginning of that opening statement, Bloch says, it's just amazing that he said this out loud, that like when he was doing his like, graduate research, he was, because he was sweating the Chicago stuff too much, he was researching rent control, but like not all of the data lined up with, with libertarian assumptions about how rent control worked, from which he concluded, man, I wonder if we're wrong about this. Maybe that's like more complicated than like my models would say. Maybe rent control doesn't always have bad consequences. Nope. His conclusion was that it's a mistake to try to verify any of this.
Just believe what I have. Just believe what I think right now. That's correct, and don't try to verify it, because you'll find out that it's wrong, and that's wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
He also, by the way, called David D. Friedman a socialist.
Yes, he did, which is amazing.
Yeah, and then of course they had that delightful exchange about how the Zoom settings worked.
What? I can't see you. Where am I? I'm not on the computer. What's going on? Why am I not on the computer? That like. It's okay. It's okay. Like he's like, no, he's not on the computer. You should do something. That's like, no. It's okay, Dr. Bloch. That like it's just how the Zoom call works. Mm-hmm. I'm not exaggerated. There were like a solid 5 minutes of this. It was, and
I should also add that one of the things that really stood out to me was when he called David a socialist. He also, I think this happened at pretty much the same time, but if not slightly thereafter, he not only called David a socialist, but he said like one of the reasons he said that is because Chicago School of Economics believe that market failures exist, that at some point the market can do something wrong. or yeah, and
that
there's evidence.
Yeah, exactly. That Chicago School of Economics leaves open the possibility that sometimes markets doing their thing, without government intervention could be a bad result. And some sort of government intervention, therefore, they couldn't use their economic theory to explain why government intervention in every single case would always be wrong, which is, of course, socialism. Socialism is when you believe that we shouldn't have like total Mad Max, like no intervention whatsoever in anything that goes on in any market, which is the conclusion of the Communist Manifesto, right? It's like workers of the world vote for moderate libertarians who might not oppose every conceivable government regulation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's bizarre too, because like even when it comes to like market failures and stuff, and this is something that Austrians also deny, is our natural monopolies. Like if you guys are thinking about this, it doesn't make sense for each competing rail company in the United States to build their own special tracks for their trains. Obviously, one track for all of the trains makes sense, even if the trains are run by different companies. Same thing like with your utility bills. Like nobody wants a million different wires. So if you go from AT&T to Verizon, you have to plug into like the Verizon cable connection as opposed to the AT&T cable connection. There are certain services and industrial aspects in society. Another great example, I think, would be like water pipes. That it makes no sense to not share one delivery system. And of course, that is a natural monopoly. So the only way you get competition in that instance is like in New York, where when they hook up your power, you can choose which company you get your power from like a list of it. But that's only because the government has made that happen. Same thing with internet. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, it really is like amazing. And the thing I remember back in April, I think that's right, mid-April of last year, I went to Florida and did this debate with Gene Epstein at the Zoho Forum. And the thing that I was most disappointed that he, I've got to say, deep disagreements about everything notwithstanding. I do like Gene. I've got a certain soft spot for a given type of like cranky old Jewish man who's like, that's like it's Bernie, Gene Epstein, but like, I have to say, he did kind of weave out of answering was like, okay, but how serious are you about the idea of completely divorcing the state from the economy? Because do you actually believe that if there were no like government issued currency and that there are no like public highways and like we could keep going in this vein, right? That like there would be just as much commerce going on and like just as much of a thriving economy as we have right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah. And I so anarcho-capitalism is as I mentioned last time, I've been arguing with these people since like 2014. I did it so long I fought the final boss. Like one of the weird things that I've noticed with them is they tend to go one of two ways. They either go the Christopher Cantwell fascist route or, extreme kind of Republican, but they like to smoke weed. Or they learn a bit more and turns out they were confused mutualists the entire time. And so like, I've always had this theory that anarcho-capitalism is essentially a psyop. And I base this on the fact that Rothbard says in one essay, he comes right out and says right-wing libertarians are not anarchists. And then another essay, he comes up and he says it was such a big win when our side captured the word libertarian from the anarchists. And then you're like, okay, and then he founds anarcho-capitalism. It's obvious what he's trying to do there is get a hold of the anarchist critique of power use it to attack state socialists and even, social democrats, anybody that wants the state, well, not really the state, the government, but wants the government to be involved in economics, and then simultaneously obscure and destroy the entire history of left libertarianism, which has been, that goes back to Joseph de Jacques, and even further back to, Proudhon and the more radical currents of the French Revolution. So I've always had that theory, and so like, it is weird if you are talking to a committed ANCAP and you want to go down that route. Some of them will very much be like, there was a late Rothbard period where he was trying to be like a little bit of a socialist. I think you mentioned it, where he was against like...
well, pretty early, right? I mean, like late 60s, early 70s kind of era, right? I don't know exactly, but like he had... There was this like period when he was trying to ally with the New Left, and he'd have these, he had a couple of confiscation of the homestead principle. That's the essay I'm thinking of, where he's sort of trying to like find ways of like fusing like socialist conclusions with like his kind of deontological libertarian property rights ideas. So like, the workers should control things because they're homesteading them, things like that. But then he gave up on that about as extremely as you could give up on that, certainly by the 90s when. So yeah, I actually found this. So it's not David Duke's run for president. I think it's when David Duke was running for governor of Louisiana or senator for Louisiana, but it's like definitely a Louisiana state election. And the particularly insane thing about this is that, so this is the 1991 election in Louisiana. It was the gubernatorial election in Louisiana in 1991. David Duke actually won the Republican nomination for governor of Louisiana in 1991. He was the Republican candidate. And then he lost, which is the election I've seen Adolph Reed refer to, where people were banding around the slogan because the guy, like the Democrat was this like pretty like corrupt old school kind of Louisiana politician. People were using the slogan "Vote for the crook, not the fascist."
I would prefer the crook to the fascist as well. The other thing, by the way, and I don't want to make this all about Rothbard, but this is just so people who maybe don't have the experience of constantly debating these weirdos that I do. If anybody is doubting that and thinks maybe anarcho capitalists are anarchists, all you really got to do is look at Rothbard's quote, "Cops must be unleashed and allowed to administer instant punishment, subject, of course, to liability when they are in error." That's how far it goes.
Yeah, that is the ultimate libertarian position. That's cool. The cops would abuse this power because you can sue them, because that's all it takes to stop anybody from doing anything that would be rights violated is suing them. That's very consistent in a terrifying way. So I found Rothbard's essay about David Duke, right-wing populism from 1992. And so, whether or not there's an official, according to Hoyle, endorsement or not, he does seem to be very sad that he lost. Right? It says, well, they finally got David Duke, but he sure scared the bejesus out of them. It took a massive campaign of hysteria, fear, and hate orchestrated by all wings of the ruling elite, capital R, capital L, from the capital O official right to left, from President Bush and the official Republican Party through the New York, Washington-run national media. Man, that almost sounds like he wants to say something else before run. Through the local elites and down to local left-wing activists. Took a massive scare campaign, not only invoking the old bogey images of Klan and Hitler, but a threat to boycott Louisiana, to pull tourists and conventions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But even so, David Duke picked up 55% of the white vote. He lost in the runoff because the fear campaign brought out a massive outpouring of black voters. But
again, I wonder why, if it looks like David Duke is going
to become your governor. Jesus Christ. and he complains, right? Um,
This, by the way, this essay is the same essay, if I'm not mistaken, where he does say that it was one gratifying thing about their rise to power was that they were able to steal the word libertarian. And also this gem here, which is take back the streets, get rid of the bums. Again, unleash the cops to clear the streets of bums and vagrants. Where will they go? Who cares? Hopefully they will disappear, that is, move from the ranks of the petted and cosseted bum class to the ranks of the productive members of society.
That sounds simultaneously very libertarian and very populist, right? That that. So he's so libertarian. He wants the cops to, he wants the cops to, like, I don't know, beat, arrest, like whatever, people for the crime of living in the street. And he's also so populist that he wants the cops to, beat and arrest people for the crime of living in the street. It doesn't really sound like he's being either of the things that he says he is, but I do. He says,
he also clarifies in the Take Back the Streets. He clarifies that he's not talking about white collar criminals or inside traders, but specifically street criminals.
Yeah, that's a helpful clarification. Yeah. And he's saying, other people get to have radical, if it's okay to be a commie or a weatherman or whatever in your wild youth, why isn't it okay to have been a Klansman? That's definitely exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
He has a right-wing populist program, blah, 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 slash taxes, slash welfare, abolish racial group privileges, take back the streets, crush criminals. Here's the line. And by this, of course, I mean not white-collar criminals or insider traders, but violent street criminals, robbers, muggers. Seems like he almost wants to say something else that would end with those bunch of those same letters. Rapists, murderers. Cops must be unleashed and allowed to administer instant punishment, subject, of course, to liability if they're in error. There we go. Take back the streets, get rid of the bum, abolish the Fed. Oh, America first. Yeah, there's that slogan. And most libertarianishly evolved, defend family values. That's interesting.
Yeah, especially, I mean, libertarians defending family values, that is quite weird, just in general. Like, I don't, again, these are like Republicans who want to smoke weed a lot of the time, or confused mutualists, left libertarians. But like, yeah, like, defend family values, that definitely falls against the sort of Jerry Rubin kind of right-wing values in right-wing libertarianism.
Yeah, you would think so. Right? It says, which means get the state out of the family and replace state control with parental control. In the long run, this means ending public schools, replace them with private schools. But we must realize that voucher and even tax credit-free schemes are not, despite Milton Friedman, transitional demands the path to privatized education. Instead, they'll make matters worse. Okay, this is just some intra-libertarian bickering about tactics.
Is he going after? Did I hear he was going after? Milton Friedman. So this argument has been going on quite a long time. The Austrians versus the Chicago School.
No, that's true. That's true. Like Murray Rothbard, who's a big influence on Block, is going after David Friedman's dad here. So that's it. All comes around.
And I'll tell you, if you put a gun to my head and make me choose, I'm going to choose the Chicago School, because so far David D. Friedman is making a very strong case, and I'm looking forward to seeing some sparks fly.
That would not be the first time that somebody has been forced by a gun to the head to accept the teachings of the Chicago School. But
oh my God, you're right.
Yeah. We must try, short of ultimate privatization, to operate government facilities in a manner most conducive to a business or to neighborhood control. But that means the public schools must allow prayer, and we must abandon the absurd left atheist interpretation of the First Amendment that establishment of religion means not allowing prayer in schools.
Oh my God.
We must return to common sense and original intent.
He's like triggering like young Republican Brent, who was like, because I was, before I grew up and got out of the thing when I was like 18, still living at home, like I was like very Republican. And like even then I was like really heavily against prayer in school. So like this is before I even went to college and was like a right libertarian for a while, because at the time I think I didn't hate gay people, and they were trying to take away their right to get married, and I felt like that was a betrayal of Republican and libertarian values. Little did I know.
Yeah, it is. It is amazing, like thinking back to that, like just how much, like 2000s, like early, like late 90s, early 2000s Republicans hated gay people. Like it's like kind of weird looking back at it, because like now you can have like, you know, like like Milo being gay was basically fine with them. It was fun, and like, but like a couple weeks ago, for this, we watched, me and Rob Larson watched Christopher Hitchens's 1999 debate. I think it was 99 with, or 2000, one of those with Phil Donahue for, Bill Donahue for the Catholic League. And like there's this like audience of like late 90s right-wing Catholics, and like when Hitchens says that you forget homosexuality can not only be a form of sex but a form of love. In other words, like gay people can love each other. There's just this wave of derisive laughter from the right-wing Catholic audience, because like that's what they were like then.
Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I should say Robert Carpenter says Rothbard was a great supporter of Malcolm X, which I've got to say kind of fits. Like this is, I don't think, hear me out here, right? Like, because it sounds like, okay, wait a second, like how is he supporting a radical black leader if he has all these like crazy, white nationalist adjacent positions? And okay, maybe some of that was like part of like new, Rothbard's new left phase. But also, I can imagine late crazy as shit Rothbard still liking Malcolm X, because it's like, especially depending on what phase of Malcolm X's careers we're talking about, for kind of the same reason that like the Klan kind of like Marcus Garvey, right? That's like, oh, so you want separation of the races? Sounds good to me, man. Like you have this like super socially conservative religious movement, that wants to, that like believes in self-reliance and, black businesses and racial separatism. I don't know that, it sounds like you're talking our language.
Yeah. To toss another bone to Rothbard, by the way, because I have spent a lot of time dragging him through the mud. He also recognized very quickly that Ayn Rand was all kinds of messed up, and just like her authoritarian tendencies, and immediately kind of distanced himself, famously writing a short play about it that was partially performed by Jeffrey Tucker at like his 80th birthday or something. Yeah, so like he wrote a short play as a takedown of a very like carefully not carefully concealed Ayn Rand.
Yeah, and I should say, I do know, of course, at the end of his life, Malcolm X was moving in a vastly better direction in many ways, right? But like, there's like a lot of like classic Malcolm that I could see like even very late Rothbard vibing with.
Yeah.
All right, we need to get back to the debate. So when we left off, Friedman had just finished, like they had giant opening statements. So Friedman had just finished his, and then announced, this is like a little bit Walter Blockish. Like Friedman then announced that he was dropping 7 pages of his notes about all the stuff Rothbard was on in the Zoom chat, which is, all right.
And he also showed us the URL on the video so we can type it in.
Yes, as people do. All right, let's do this. Yeah, here we go.
Logan? Great. Good. I don't think I'm going to convince David of Austrianism somehow. I didn't work with Gary Becker, didn't work with David, but
that's not the objective, it's to convince you.
Well, no, the objective is to convince each other, and so far I don't think I'm going to convince you. I don't think you're going to convince me either, but that's a different issue. Look, on this illustration, David, and testing, David says one of the benefits of testing is that you come up with new ideas. And that's true. You do come up with new ideas when you confront the data. But this also applies to illustrating. And again, what's testing what? I go back to Gary Becker saying, you know, go out and do it again until you get it right. I think that the cart is before the horse if we think that we're really testing these apodictic necessarily truths. Now, David misstates my view on minimum wage. I never said that a minimum wage will lead to more unemployment of unskilled workers. I never said that. If I said, I made a mistake. What I should have said, what I think I said was that the minimum wage will lead to more unemployment than would otherwise have occurred. And since we never know what would otherwise have occurred, it's not testable, it's not falsifiable, and yet it tells us something about the real world. Now, David mentions several cases where the minimum wage can backfire, namely, there won't be any more unemployment of unskilled workers. And he's particularly brilliant, I think, a little pat on the back to David, in talking about these consumers that have this wild-eyed demand curve that they only want to buy from well-paid workers, and therefore they shift their demand curve to the right. But we don't have to go into that. And the whole thing with monopsony, I think, is highly problematic. And monopoly, I'll get to that in a minute. You see, the problem with monopoly and monopsony is, how do you define the industry? If you define the industry as, I don't know, breakfast cereals, well, then you'll get a certain concentration ratio. If you define the industry as all breakfast food, well, then you'll get a lower concentration ratio. If you define it as all food, then you'll get a much lower. And the plaintiffs want to define it in one way, and the defendants want to define it the other way. I think that this whole Chicagoite and mainstream view on monopoly is highly problematic. But in addition to monopsony, you see, monopsony creates the same problem as I illustrated with monopoly, interpersonal comparison utility. They're comparing what would occur under monopsony with what would occur under perfect competition. And the way I illustrated it, what would occur under monopoly with perfect competition. And the Achilles heel of that is interpersonal comparisons utility. Now, obviously, it's not going to really work for a minimum wage, because monopsony only applies to highly skilled workers, you know, maybe computer people or professional football players or somebody like that. There are millions of people who hire, millions of firms that hire unskilled workers. So the monopsony thing is silly. I gave the example of Bill Gates, or there's a boom. There are many ways that the minimum wage can be implemented and increase in unskilled workers. But that's not the point. You have to hold ceteris paribus. David is not holding ceteris paribus. He's changing other things. The whole point of economics is to have other things equal. You only want to change one thing at a time. If you change a minimum wage and you change something else, then you never know what the result stems from. Look, take these people who will shift their demand curve. If you had ceteris paribus, they would do it whether we had a minimum wage or not. And David is just saying, well, they'll shift their demand curve. Well, they would have shifted it anyway. Namely, we would have had even more unemployment because they weren't buying from unskilled workers in the first place. So I think David makes a rookie mistake here, that he's not holding ceteris paribus. He's not holding other things equal. He's changing 2 or 3 or 5 things at the same time, and then attributing the result to what he wants to attribute it to. Okay, enough on the minimum wage. Let me move on. This thing about diminishing marginal utility, because the first bottle of water is more important than the second or the third. And then he comes up with the case of tires. And Murray's answer to that as well. the proper unit of tires is 4 tires. And David says, well, where does he get that from? Well, Murray's a maniac. He thinks that you need 4 tires to run a car. But not necessarily, because suppose what you really want to do is put a rut in the road. So you have 3 tires, and the 4th thingy puts a rut in the road. Well, then Murray is right. Then if that's your purpose, then you don't need 4 tires. But for most people, 4 tires is a unit. And if you start saying, well, you have 2 tires and the 3rd tire isn't going to really do you much good, but the 4th tire is going to do you a lot of good, and therefore you have increasing margin utility, I think that's highly problematic. Then the increase in increasing margin utility of leisure. Again, units. If you have to do something for 2 hours, then it's 2-hour units. And where do you get that from? You get it right from David, because he says you have to have 2 hours to do the thing. So I think David is being very unfair in criticizing Murray on this sort of a thing. Time preference. The usual attempted reputation is ice in summer and ice in winter. And right now we're in the winter, and do we really want more ice? And we're not in New Orleans. We're in Canada somewhere with this ice up to our armpits. We got plenty of ice. And you might say, well, we really, this is before refrigeration, we really want ice in the summer, but the summer isn't going to be here for 6 months. So this refutes time preference for the present. Nonsense. Ice in summer and ice in winter are different goods. How do we get that? I don't know where we get that from. Common sense. I mean, ice in winter is a different good than ice in summer. Yes, the chemical properties are the same, but we don't go by chemical properties. We go by people using these things. And you really have no need for ice in the winter, but you have plenty of need for ice in the summer. Mises, I think, is brilliant on this. What he says is, look, if there's no time preference for the present, what you'll do is you'll put off acting until the future. But then you get to the future and you're still not going to act because you have time preference for the future again. Namely, you'll never act. So he deduces praxeologically that there has to be time preference for the present because people act. And we know that people act because if you try to deny that people act, that's an action. So you can't deny it. It's synthetic a priori, as I've been trying to tell David about methodology here. The next thing he gets into is fractional reserve banking. And this is a little hitting below the belt because David and I agreed we would only talk about economics. And we did say that if we liked this and we thought it was a productive thing, we would have another debate on libertarianism. And I regard whether fractional reserve banking is fraudulent or not as a part of libertarianism. Fraudulent is not an economic issue. Fraudulent is a crime. And a crime is libertarian. So I think David was hitting a little bit below the belt to mention that. And I'm not sure if I want to respond to that. Well, I don't know. Let me see if I have time for that. I want to go to the optimal amount of money. I wrote an article with my colleague Bill Barnett. I disagree with David very fervently on fractional reserve banking, but I think it's unfair for me to respond to that because David violated our agreement. Okay, I wrote an article with Bill Barnett on the optimal amount of currency, or the optimal amount of gold if gold is currency. And what we came up with is that whatever the market decides. Well, David is saying, no, because if you can do the same stuff with 500 gold ounces as 1,000 gold ounces, the extra 500 are superfluous and wasteful and stuff like that. And that means that we should tax gold mining or something like this. And his father, Milton Friedman, was always calling us gold people gold bugs or gold maniacs or whatever it was, because we favored gold, because gold was, Milton had this show, Free to Choose, which is a beautiful title. But when people were free to choose, they chose gold. They didn't choose the Fed, which he favors. And why does he favor the Fed? Because we can increase, you don't want to say GDP, fine. I'm just as much against GDP as David is. Economic welfare, or GDP, or whatever you want to call it. the reason we want to have the optimal amount of gold is because that's what people are always choosing, and what Milton and other Chicagoites are doing is trying to impose on the market and saying, well, the market, they were free to choose gold, but they chose too much gold, so we have another market failure. And I forgot to include that as a market failure. And I, as an Austrian economist, don't believe in any market failures. Why do we have so much gold? Milton and David think, well, the extra amount of gold is superfluous. Well, why do we have fences and locks? Fences and locks are superfluous. If nobody ever stole anything, we wouldn't need fences and locks.
All right.
Well, who's going to steal? 10 minutes.
Start to wrap up. Yes, sir.
God, 10 minutes goes by so
You can
quickly.
finish your final point. I'm gonna give him equal time as well, though.
Well, I don't know what to say. I want to talk a little bit about monopoly. I did talk about monopoly. The whole thing is a crock. It depends upon how you define the industry, and they define it arbitrarily. There's also a tendency for prices to equalize and profits to equalize, and that is another synthetic a priori. It gives us great knowledge of what's going on. And with regard to Coase, he might not have mentioned GDP. He might have mentioned human welfare. I don't remember. I sometimes use them as synonymous. But the point is that Coase is a central planner. He is going to give me David's shirt because I value it more. And how does Coase know that? I don't think he knows any such thing. Okay, I guess my 10 minutes are up. I'm sorry I went over.
All right.
I was muted there. I just said, wow.
Yeah, wow is right. So one thing I think I caught here, and I feel like I must be misunderstanding him because this is such a, even for Walter Block, this would be a very odd claim. So he's arguing that you can't define that, like, there's no such thing as a monopoly or monopsony
Because of how you define the industry.
because how you define the industry. So if I am the only seller of donuts in Atlanta, my donut empire is such that there are no, that nobody could get a donut from anybody but me anymore. Well, is it a monopoly? Is it not a monopoly? I mean, what if he doesn't also control the supply of apple fritters? Is it the same thing? Like am I accurately capturing the argument here?
Yeah. He's essentially, so this actually got me as well, because I keyed into that. This is the problem of identity. Alan Watts actually talks about this a lot, and he'll say, so Walter Block is presenting it like defining the industry is essentially arbitrary, and you can define the industry any way you want to. Therefore, this thing does not exist. That just doesn't work 100%, because the explanation that Alan Watts gives is, how big is the sun? So how do we define the sun? Is it the extent of its light? Is it the extent of its fire? Is it like, you can choose how you define the sun, but there's essentially a level of arbitrariness in choosing exactly what something is, that we always just mentally draw that line. And obviously, just because we arbitrarily draw the line doesn't mean the sun does not exist.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, yeah, no, that seems like exactly the right response. That's like, yeah, okay, like, you can make different choices about how you're gonna define categories or use words, and to a certain extent, we could just do like, okay, I see we're talking past each other. What you mean is blah, 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 and what I mean is blah, blah, blah. But, like, also, I mean, come on, Walter Block doesn't believe that there's no such thing as an industry, right? That we can't make and understand and agree with or disagree with claims about what's going on with some industry. So, like, the fact that, there are different ways of drawing the border, that there's like some semantic indeterminacy about, the, whatever, the donut industry versus the breakfast pastry industry or whatever. Like, it still does kind of seem like we, like the idea that this just makes it utterly meaningless to talk about anybody having a monopoly or monopsony level of economic power is, even by Walter Block standards, that is thoroughly odd.
So it may be you're thinking this may be an ad hoc position he's just adopted to attack the argument, and it's not something he really believes.
I would be I guess, I don't know. I mean, maybe we could, like, I have not made a thorough study of like Walter Block's various pronouncements, which would be an interesting way to spend one's life, but it's not a choice I've made. Like what I know about Walter Block is pretty much his debate with me, and I think before that I watched like, a couple of his debates with Sam Cedar as like prep, and like now this. And like I think I saw like maybe 2 other YouTube videos of him while I was like researching before that debate I had with him. So I guess I don't know, but man, I would be so surprised if there are no instances in which Walter Block like makes statements about like such and such happened in the car industry for this reason.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this actually, since you bring up the car industry, this was another thing that jumped out at me when he said you don't need 4 tires if you're tearing up the road, like as if there is a car somewhere with 3 tires, and in the place of 1 tire is like some sort of bladed instrument to attack the road. Like, no, if you want to carve a thing in the road, you get a machine that is not a car, and usually that also has 4 wheels with tires.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is kind of, I don't know, it's exactly the continuum fallacy, Darius, but I know what you mean. It's definitely, at the very least, something with a family resemblance to the continuum fallacy. So the continuum fallacy is where you say, I don't know exactly where to draw the line between 2 things, therefore there just is no line, or there's no, like, there's no real distinction between these things, or there aren't clear cases. Actually, as I'm talking, I think maybe this is an example of continuum fallacy, because it's like you say, okay, do you like, are there things that we would like clearly, like even Walter Block maybe would admit that it's a monopoly because like he can't come up with any other way to, to draw the boundaries, and there are things where like are very clear, like I think it seems like there are things that like, we can't like. Maybe not Walter Block, but like the entirety of the rest of the human race would acknowledge would be a monopoly.
Yeah.
And there are things that like nobody would try to claim as a monopoly. And sure, maybe some of these problems with semantic indeterminacy, like, oh, does the word, like is the, what's the relevant category that we should be using to decide, whether this is a monopoly of X, right? What's the right X to put in there? Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, maybe has something to do with like what would actually be like a competitor that, that people would have to be afraid of, right? When they do this. But like, come on, that doesn't mean that there aren't any monopolies or any monopsonies. I mean, maybe what it means is that there like might be cases in which it's unclear whether there's a significant way that something counts as a monopoly or a monopsony, right? That you could like that like, I don't know, like there's like a specialty dish at a restaurant and you say like, oh, so I guess they have a monopoly on that dish, but that doesn't really seem to be the kind of monopoly, that we're usually concerned with when we're like doing trust busting. But like, I don't know.
I mean, you could say, my comic, Deruti, Shadow of the People, you could say I have a monopoly over that particular comic because I'm the only one making it. But like, it's not like you couldn't go and buy a different comic book or even try to find like a comic about Deruti if somebody's made it, who's not me. It's not like I could stop you from doing that. So like, yeah, it's a very weird argument. And it's interesting also that he kind of goes down this road with the, I guess, subjectivity, because he argued that ice in winter is a different product than ice in the summer, which is definitely not true. because people buy ice in the winter and the summer for the same reason, to keep stuff cool where it's warm. So for instance, like, a while ago, my wife and I, our refrigerator broke down. And so I went out in winter and bought ice to put it in my refrigerator so that the food wouldn't go bad while we were getting a new fridge. So no, it's definitely not a completely different product. You just buy less of it in the winter.
Yeah, which is, man, makes me think of the ice being brought into the Quickie Mart, for the people who like mined it from the North Pole.
Or the ice man cometh.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so I was just gonna say though, like the ice in winter, ice in summer thing, like, I don't know, maybe the monopoly thing, this is just some super eccentric view that like Walter Block like really like deeply holds. But the ice in winter, ice in summer thing, that just struck me as like totally ad hoc, that it's like, well, if we have like in the presence of an apparent counterexample to your view, like find a way to define it as not, as not being that, right? Like that this is
using the continuum fallacy, or I usually will in debates call it like the fallacy of the beard, or how many grains of sand make a pile.
Yeah. No, same, right, exactly, right. Like the Sorites paradox, or I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but yeah, that exact thing. How many grains make a pile? That it would obviously be absurd to say it exactly 10,569 grains is a pile. If you have 10,568, it's not a pile yet. 10,569 is a pile. That would be ridiculous. But if you then conclude from that one grain more or less can't make a difference, that if X number of grains isn't a pile, X plus 1 is a pile, then apply that principle a million times, and you could have like, a pile, like a huge pile, and definitionally not be a pile. So like, yeah, it's like that's like a really tricky puzzle, to figure out what to say about. But one thing everybody who has thought about it pretty much agrees on is, just because it's unclear where to draw the line, that doesn't mean that there isn't a distinction, or that there aren't clear cases on both ends. So again, if this is a kind of example of it, right, that like there could be, yeah, I mean, right, there are things that like clearly we would call a monopoly, there are things that nobody would call a monopoly, and there are things where it's a little bit unclear what the relevant category is. But that doesn't mean that the first two categories don't exist. And yeah, maybe similarly here, like what counts as a different good, right? Because if it's that every goddamn thing has to be the same, then you've just like ruled out a priori competition being a thing that could exist in the world, because nobody's ever selling exactly the same thing. Like, and if you're just saying, well, any-time when people would want it or not want it for different reasons, it's not the same good, because we don't go by the chemicals, right? Like that's, that just seems really, really ad hoc to me.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I've also noticed that libertarians really like to use the continuum fallacy, usually in arguments against taxation. They'll be like, oh, what's the rich? What amount of money? Give me a number of dollars to tax right now, or otherwise we can't tax anybody anything. And it seems like I've noticed that certain political persuasions have certain blind spots, just generally speaking. Libertarians seem to have a lot of problems with the continuum fallacy, and then they also tend to have a lot of problems, I think, with I'll explain this in a minute, but it gets into my next thing that I wanted to say. But Ben, you say what you were going to, and then I'll make my next point.
Yeah. I think that's right. Like, yeah, the demand that like you quantify things or else it's not right. So of course the game is that if you say, I believe that the top marginal tax rate, should be 90%. They say, oh, so you agree that 90.5 would be unjust, right? That's like, it's silly, right? I mean, this is why this actually came up at my debate with noted populist Charlie Kirk last year, where he kind of did that, right? Like, what's the right rate, to tax rich people, and my response, it's not like this is not like there's some magic number here.
Yeah.
The question is like what principles you're going to use to evaluate, whether a tax system is a good system or not, right? Which are you're going to have a discussion about moral principles, and of course those aren't going to that's not going to spit out like a precise percentage for you, right? But like you could definitely use them to evaluate whether given percentages are real. I mean, it's like the same way that's like, look, you have a moral obligation to feed your children, right? You shouldn't let them go hungry. Oh, really? Okay. So you're saying I have an obligation. What is the precise number of nutrients that I have an obligation to give my children every day? I mean, like how many grains of rice, need to be on their plates every day? Am I failing this obligation? If I'm 2 grains of rice short, like it's silly. Like, no, like the principle that it's morally wrong not to feed your children is not going to spit that out, but it's definitely going to tell us that if they get 1 meal a day, you haven't filled it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this actually kind of gets into the other big problem that they tend to have is the hasty equivocation fallacy. I normally look at that when they say taxation is theft, for instance. But so what I wanted to get into here, this is an argument that I see a lot from libertarians, and it was actually I debated Stefan Molyneux a little while ago. You've debated him. This is an argument that Stefan Molyneux really likes to make, and he pretend like he invented it. He calls it like self-detonating statements. So Walter here said that von Mises, the fact that people act is a self-evident statement, because if you deny it, you are taking an action, and therefore, you're wrong, which is just completely wrong. I mean, it sounds intuitive, but what you're doing is you're just begging the question there. You've defined what an action is, and then you have to presuppose that is exactly an individual action that someone's taking. So essentially, you define you need to define action in a very specific way to rule out action in that argument.
Yeah, and especially because, I mean, if you know a little bit about, or whatever, like you were just paying attention to Walter's epic opening statement, like action doesn't just mean like something a person is doing in the sense that like sleepwalking is an action, blinking is an action, breathing is an action, right? Like action means something way more specific in this context, right? Like that. I mean, there is basically a theory of free will here. So the more you I think you're absolutely right. It's an equivocation, because like the more you pack into it, and if they're not packing tons of stuff into their definition of action, then like man acts is like pretty uninformative, right? It's like,
right.
Okay, no kidding, right? That's just like stuff happens, and some of it involves people, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're packing all this stuff in, but then of course, like, look, if you think that the people aren't motivated, aren't acting in the robustly voluntary ways that are motivated the way they think they are, then like if you deny that, it's like, oh, haha, you see, you are acting. It's like, well, no, not like you mean, right? I don't agree with that.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting too, because even if we did define action in the way that he wants us, and even if we ignore that he's begging the question, the issue then becomes, do we actually have action, or do we have the appearance of action? Is the fact that mankind acts simply an illusion? Because I mean, like, if you're talking, this gets into a lot of stuff with determinism versus libertarian free will. But it's like, when someone decides to do something, when you decide to take an action, if we are to take that as, a serious act of free will, then they also have to decide to decide. And then they have to decide to decide on and on and on for an infinite regress. So
If you think that that it's only free will if there's no, it doesn't trace back, like, yeah, if your theory of free will is that it's not free, if it could be traced back to anything that you didn't, that you didn't decide to do, right? That like if there's any chain of cause and effect leading to what you're doing that terminates in something that you didn't choose, then it's not free. Then yeah, you might run into problems like this.
Mm-hmm. I really feel like they use this argument. They use it a lot. It's a really bad argument, but it feels very intuitive. I've compared it oftentimes to like the fact that like they say life begins at conception, like pro-life, and I don't agree with that. But it sounds like you should agree with it. Like it makes sense to our common sense in our culture at this time, even though it's wrong, or at least limited.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Like it's again, I think it's weird. I think that the assumption, like, man acts means like, people act in ways that like fit all the stuff that the theory is going to say about action. I mean, like that's essentially what man acts means. So you boil it down to 2 syllables, right? But like, and see, it's so absurd to deny it, right? What do you like? You're doing an action, you're denying, right? But it's like, I don't, is every denial robustly voluntary in the way that they think it is? They think that things have to be. I mean, honestly, I think even your smarter libertarians about free will don't try to claim that like everything any person does, that like, even as like a conscious action is a robustly free decision, right? I mean, like you're like the best, I mean, look, this is not to say that I buy it, right? But like the best version of libertarian free will is the Robert Kane version, where you basically say like most things that most people do are sort of on autopilot, because that's like empirically insane to deny. I mean, that's like just clearly true. And but there are certain like character forming actions that are robustly voluntary, and then you put in some quantum physics and some magic, to like explain how those work, but like again, I don't buy it, right? But I mean, that's the more sophisticated version, where you say that like, well, most of the time we're kind of on autopilot to some extent, but our actions when we're sort of on autopilot are shaped by our characters, and we have these like key moments of character forming action, and those are robustly under our control. That's at least like the way smarter version than just like, oh, see, you denied, you acted, right? Which is like, yeah, if you, I mean, like, sure, in the common sense, intuitive way, right, is a denial an action, right? Like given what most people mean by action, yeah, of course, a denial is an action, right? But like, is it going to be an action in the sense that like it matches all the requirements of the theory, and it's going to like generate all of the predictions of the theory? I mean, that's like a really different question.
Yeah. So essentially, like what I was getting at, by the way, with the life begins at conception argument, in the fact that it makes a lot of intuitive sense. This also kind of it shows, it's the issue of the continuum. So if a pro-life person argues, for instance, that life begins at conception, they say, well, it's because you have created a fetus, and that fetus will grow into a baby, and that baby will be born. Therefore, that's the beginning. And it makes a lot of intuitive sense to our brains to define it that way. But if they're defining the life as a process, supposedly beginning at conception, the problem there becomes that conception also has events leading up to it. And it is just as arbitrary to start it at conception as it is to, for instance, when your parents meet, or when your grandparents meet, or any other thing. The line of I guess sort of the line of events that feed into the process that is life it could be drawn at any point in that continuum if you wanted to do that. Now, that's not to say that there aren't, other reasons there, but I really feel like that is one of the arguments that like you hear from the right a lot, it makes intuitive sense. It's very hard to argue against because of like where our common sense is at the culture, but it is ultimately wrong, and they're not thinking about it hard enough.
Yeah, I mean, if that's their argument for saying, like, you know, to the extent, and you know, some anti-abortionists definitely do make this argument. If their argument for life beginning at the conception is that like it's so hard to non-arbitrarily draw a line, you know, and you know, when they say life begins, I mean, I think again it's a little bit like man acts, right? Like, yeah, technically speaking, yes, right? I mean, like that there is like, if you literally mean like, you know, you're just talking about like a purely physical process, you know, that like there's something that's going to like satisfy enough of the items on a biologist checklist for life, you know, that we can count it, right? Then sure. But like, you know, if you're going to say that the fetus is a, you know, the zygote is a person from the moment of conception, because you know, you can't non-arbitrarily draw a line, then yeah, I mean, that's like, you know, I mean, that's, I think for exactly the reason you're saying, that's silly. I mean, this is, you know, the point that Judith Jarvis Thompson makes at the beginning of her classic paper about abortion, that like you know, an acorn is not an oak tree, but like, what is the precise moment where it becomes an oak tree? You know, good luck with that, right? Like,
which again, continuum fallacy.
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. And I think, I also think, like, I heard the other day, there's this guy, there's this philosopher who's like a bit of a libertarian troll, and like people, you know, there are always kind of controversies swirling around him. It's like Kirsch something, I don't remember exactly, but like I heard part of a podcast with him the other day where I will give credit where credit's due, that like he made like a really good point about the, you know, about the standard worldview of pro-lifers, which is that they seem to want to kind of have it both ways about what makes you, right? What makes a person a person. Because if you're a pro-lifer and B, like an intensely devout Christian, which like 99.999% of them are, well, when you're saying life begins the conception, you are adopting like an animalistic view, right, of what a person is. That like you know, that it's like this purely physical definition of what a person is. You know, like they'll even say things like, look, I don't want to hear about this personhood stuff. You're just changing the subject, right? It's a human being, you know, like it's a purely animalistic physical definition. But hold up, like, you know, so you don't believe that there's life after death then? Because like if I'm, you know, if I just am this physical entity, you know, then there's no mystery about what happens to that after you die, right? I mean, like we know exactly, you know, what happens to that after you die, right? So if you believe that there's that the thing that will be in heaven, or in my case hell, you know, like you know, is what, you know, was me, right? You know, that you know, I will be there, then let's you know, what are we talking about, right? You know, because it's like it can't both be the case that I was once a zygote, and that I will one day in the future, you know, be in, you know, heaven or hell or Valhalla or whatever, right? That they have like, you know, because, you know, like the first definition is purely physical, because like, as far as I know, not even the most intense pro-lifers think that like fetuses, like zygotes, have minds, you know, but if we're not talking about my mind, you know, being in heaven or hell or whatever, then I just don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I get you on that. I was just writing down, by the way, because I remembered there was one other thing I wanted to bring up before we move on and get David.
Yeah. Yep.
And this is that this is a tendency I've noticed in libertarians. They tend to oftentimes confuse the subject. Well, one, they think if something is subjective, it's arbitrary and just goes anywhere with it. But they also tend to confuse the subjective with the objective. So, for instance, I usually use to explain this murder. Murder happens, you know, but murder does not exist in nature. What has happened, in fact, is a killing. And what makes a killing murder is a judgment. It is a subjective judgment in the mind of a person, or a subjective judgment written into the laws. So, for instance, if we are to define what murder is, if we're talking about like a purely legal definition, what you have is criteria that the murder may objectively meet that criteria, but the fact that you have set that criteria for the murder to meet it was inherently subjective, not arbitrary. And because these guys are really obsessed usually with natural law and natural law-based arguments, because they like to use it as an argument against taxation, they just seem to really have a hard time telling the difference between what is like what actually exists within reality and what is their brain doing something that really feels like reality but is not.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a moral realist, then you don't necessarily think that that we're ultimately what makes killing murder is a subjective judge. I mean, you can, whether you subjectively believe that it's murder is, but like whether it actually is murder, is objective on that view. But okay, this is super interesting. We've been talking forever. Let's watch the other ornery old man refute the first ornery old man.
Okay. So that was about 12 minutes. I'm going to give Dr. Friedman, you're going to have 12 minutes as well. Okay.
Let me start with the fractional reserve bank because I don't like being charged with cheating. I would point out that Walter, when I asked him for a source for Austrian economics, pointed me at Man, Economy, and State. And chapter 11 of Man, Economy, and State is where Rothbard attacks central banking. So I think pointing out both that his argument is wrong and going on to point out the economic implications, the fact that the fractional reserve bank is a way of reducing the cost of maintaining a money system, that cost being related to the fact that it's necessary to spend resources digging up gold, is entirely legitimate. Let me go on. I should also say that I'm afraid, first, Walter's response to me on time preference consisted of digging up his response to an entirely unrelated argument, namely about ice in summer and ice in winter, and ignoring the argument I actually made, which was that Rothbard gives no reason to believe his conclusion is true. Rothbard simply confuses using time in the sense of working or consuming leisure with using the time in the sense of getting something later rather than former. That's a logical mistake, and I'm sorry if it bothers Walter to be told that Rothbard has made logical mistakes, though I think he may have said it in other contexts himself once or twice. But you don't answer that by digging up your old argument against the fact that the value of the things might change. Same ice cream cone can be in the same season, still the case. With regard to minimum wage, Walter wants to claim that in my examples, it isn't cateris paribus. Mine all are cateris paribus. In my example, before and after you raise the minimum wage, people had the weird tastes that I described. Given that they have those weird tastes, ordinary economic theory predicts that raising the minimum wage will increase the employment of unskilled workers. That's the logic of the argument. Sorry about it. Similarly, in the monopsony case, it's not particularly difficult to define a monopsony in that particular case because the monopsony in question is the firm that hires all or most of the unskilled labor in a particular labor market, where I was assuming that people were sufficiently immobile so that they wouldn't move from one labor market to another unless there was a large difference in wages. And then I'm not changing anything. I'm describing the economics in a world where the labor market has a particular pattern. Now, Card and Kruger may want to argue that ours is closer to that than I think it is, and that would be an empirical question, but I'm not changing it. It's all cateris paribus. It's just that in that world, when you make one change, which is imposing a minimum wage, the result is that the demand for unskilled labor goes up instead of down. So again, he's unfortunately attacking arguments from his imagination, not the arguments that I actually made. I think Walter's view of Cosa's view it's a cartoon. The problem of social cost, which is the article in question, is moderately complicated. If he is actually curious about the implication, I spend 2 chapters in my book, Laws of Order, which he's welcome to read, In fact, I think it may even be, it is even webbed, so he can read it for free, in working out in a Coasean world what the implications are for the law. And it's basically implications not about judges redistributing things, but about having those general rules that are optimal given the points that Coase is making. So maybe Walter has confused Ronald Coase with George Stigler. The term the Coase theorem is due to Stigler, not to Coase, and the Coase theorem is a tiny piece of the analysis in the essay, Problem of Social Cost. Let me see. Oh, the cardinal utility versus ordinal utility. Rothbard, in one point in his discussion, I don't have time to dig up the exact quote now, talks about the fact that in deciding what to do, you want to take account of the uncertainty of the outcome as well as things like how long it will take. So you're making an investment project and you want to discount both for the time until you get the return and for the chance that you won't get the return. What von Neumann showed in inventing what's referred to as von Neumann utility was that one could define utility in a form in which it was cardinal rather than ordinal. And by doing so, get a description of consistent behavior under uncertainty. So it is not a matter of this is 1, 2, and 3. What he is showing is that you can reasonably model people's behavior under uncertainty, given some plausible assumptions of how people act, in a way such that you have a utility on any outcome, and you then, faced with a lottery with an uncertain set of outcomes, you choose that outcome, you choose that lottery, which maximizes the expected value of utility. So that is a way of doing what Rothbard is claiming you have to do, but he doesn't have any idea how, namely discounting for uncertainty, of incorporating that within the normal structure of economics. That's what he's doing. Part of what Walter started with was his criticism of statistics. And it's true, the world is a very complicated place. And unfortunately, we very rarely can get a conclusion with certainty. We have a conjecture based on theory. That conjecture becomes more or less likely to be true as the evidence does or doesn't support it. But it's not, for anything complicated, it is very unlikely that a single regression will tell you for certainty any more than a single theory will tell you on certainty. And it's too bad that we live in a complicated, well, it's not too bad, it's interesting to live in a complicated world, but it's frustrating to live in a complicated world. And a whole lot of his criticism ultimately comes down to that. It's perfectly true that the simple model of monopoly in which a firm is a monopoly or isn't ignores all sorts of complications of the fact that you've got partial substitutes, the fact that the size of the market isn't easily defined. For example, I would claim I'm a monopoly because nobody else produces talks or books exactly like mine. But nonetheless, it is a useful set of tools because the real world consists of some markets that are close to perfect competition, some markets that are close to pure monopoly, and lots of things in between. And once you have thought through the logic of the simple cases, you are better equipped to deal with the complicated cases. And simply saying, well, sorry, it's complicated, so I don't want to think about it, is not really a solution to that problem. Let me take a look. I think I had some other things that I had noted that I wanted to say. As far as I know, my father never said that he was in favor of the Federal Reserve System. Indeed, he has extensively criticized the Federal Reserve. He's the one who argued that it was responsible for the Great Depression, among other things. I do not believe he ever said that it should be illegal to have gold as money. What he did was to take the existing system, which is a fiat money system using a sort of bizarre kind of fractional reserve banking, which is economizing on money that's costless to produce, which is sort of a weird system. And he said, given that system, what is the best way for the central bank to act? And his answer was that it should act in a way which makes the price level reasonably predictable, which it does by not trying to fine-tune the economy, but just having a constant rate of expansion of the money supply that is about the same as the expansion of the money demand, and therefore keeps prices constant. Now, he has a fancier argument in the essay on the optimal quantity of money, which actually implies that what you want is to have falling prices, but that's a fancier thing than he would expect the Federal Reserve to be able to actually run, so he's not trying to persuade them to do that. But in general, your view of of Chicago school people, and certainly of my father's, is just invented. It's a straw man. All right, I think, am I out of time now? No, I guess I'm not. I still have a minute and a half. Tried to keep track of it, and I must have had some other points I wanted.
You have 3.5 minutes.
Yes. Right.
Shirley has a few more pages of notes about Murray Rothbard.
Oh, minor point. Work is not weight times distance, it's force times distance. Those are not the same thing. Also, I am not a famous physicist. I did a few years of postdoc work in physics and then switched to economics because I thought I was better at it and it was more fun. So I do have a doctorate in physics, but I'm afraid it does not make me a prominent physicist. Or I wouldn't really say I'm even a physicist at all, since I haven't practiced physics for something like, 50 years now, close to 50 years. Let me take the question of interpersonal comparisons of utility, because that's an interesting issue, and it's something we can't do very well, and yet all of us do it. If you are deciding which of your grandchildren to give something to spend some money on a gift, or which of your grandchildren to spend some time doing with, part of what you are doing is saying, I think this kid will get more pleasure out of what I'm doing than that kid, or more pleasure out of that gift. Anytime you're deciding whether to give presents to people, part of what you're doing is trying to say, how much happier do I think this present will make them? The right way to think about this rich versus poor thing is to realize that whether you have a reason to believe that the rich person has a higher or lower marginal utility depends on the question of why he's rich. If we assume that everybody has the same utility function, and the reason that the rich person is rich is that he's good at making money or inherited money or something, then our best guess, due to the declining marginal utility, which Rothbard and Walter believe in, is that the utility he gets from an extra dollar is less than that of the poor person. On the other hand, if the reason the rich person is rich because he really likes money and works very hard, and the reason the poor person is poor is that he doesn't much like money and therefore doesn't work very hard, you then reverse the result. You can show that the rich person that has higher marginal utility. So if you actually think about these things, instead of just wringing your hands over the difficulty of doing interpersonal comparisons, you realize it's something we can't do very well, unfortunately. We necessarily do it. That every time that Walter or Rothbard is making a statement about this results in increasing the satisfaction of consumers or of producers, he is doing an interpersonal comparison, whether he admits it or not, because it's never going to be raising it for all consumers. I think that's it. I'm willing to give an extra minute to the questioners. Thank you.
All right, so
what are you thinking, Ben?
I'm thinking that it's not hard to look rational when you're arguing with Walter Block is the main thing that I'm thinking. I also have to say, just on like, I'm just gonna be like super petty and superficial and unproductive here for 90 seconds and say, I like the fact that his go-to example of cases where it's important to evaluate, somebody's utility, how much utility they're getting out of something, is choosing between your grandchildren, and and I like the fact that like Walter Block in the previous statement, when he wanted an example of skilled workers, he was like, oh, this isn't going to be, the monopsony, and that's not going to apply to the minimum wage workers. The skilled workers was computer people. That was the example of skilled workers, computer people, and that
who can web things,
and that David Friedman keeps saying webbed.
I'm sorry, that's adorable. I love that. That
does kind of make me like more, because in a way, I guess it actually makes me like both of them more, because it suggests that like they don't spend all of their time on the internet, and this is largely foreign to them, which honestly makes me think that they're like a much better and healthier variety of human being.
I would agree with that a lot. Yeah, because you have to be some kind of psycho like me to be on the internet as much. So I think that's great. What I'm looking at here, so this jumped out to me. So first off, I will say I felt that as far as like presentation and performance, like again, David was phenomenal through this response. You could even tell, even if you weren't listening to like the exact words he was saying, you could tell from his cadence, and from and also just from the fact that he was much calmer, yet also just a little bit condescending, which I loved, but not so condescending that it came off as aggressive. Like his style of speaking and his rhetoric really, it gives him the posture of someone who is a winner in this.
Yeah, he all that stuff. Like, yeah, it was like pretty condescending, but like in a way that just, that just came off as like being extremely confident about what he's saying, rather than like tipping over into aggression. I think that's exactly right. That like all that stuff, and I was like, I've got to say, you got this and that and the other thing wrong. I mean, there just is a, Murray, he had problems with the logic, and I mean, I hope that doesn't upset you. I don't know. I don't know what to say.
Now, something jumped out to me, and this was where so I've seen this a lot with libertarians. I think partially it's because of their interest in economics, and partially I think it's because of their very strong reliance on the idea of self-ownership. But if you've noticed the way David Friedman talked about people, and granted it's within the confines of an economic argument, but he talked about people like they were a product, like they were a thing. And, like, I'm not saying necessarily that that's wrong in this context, but, I think, what was it? It was Kant who said, like, people should always be treated as an end in themselves, never a means. And Kurt Vonnegut famously said that, the chief business of humanity is to be human rather than to become an appendage to machines or institutions or symbols. And it really does seem to me like that those lines where he is talking about people as though they are a commodity and talking about their utility, it may make sense but I think it also kind of shows a worldview that I would at least consider to be deeply unethical. Now, the other side of it, though, because I did like what he was talking about with his grandchildren, because you'll notice it didn't look like he was trying to say, I should give the present to the best grandchild. He was trying to think about it like, what present am I going to give to each grandchild that will maximize their happiness? It's a weird way to talk about things. It's sort of like, it's like explaining a joke. If you try to break down gift giving into that in much of an intellectual economic thing, you kind of kill the spontaneity.
So okay. So I guess I will be I will be charitable to David Friedman for a minute here, and say, I think the point that he was making was actually fine. Like I said, I think, I mean, it did make me laugh a little bit. That was an example about grandchildren, because these people are very old, right? That's a theme. That's a theme of tonight and last week. But like, I think the point he was making, I could be wrong about this, but I think it was just like a pretty simple and correct one, which is like, Block was talking as if like, nobody ever has any way of like telling like how much utility anybody is going to get out of anything, that like
It's
only
just
make
so complicated.
yeah, it's so complicated, and like I don't know. Presumably, I will not claim to have been following everything he was saying at that point. I was also, I will admit, for some of this multitasking with fact checking myself about von Mises and human action, but like it sounded like Block was saying it's like, oh, this is like ridiculous central planner shit. If you think that you can just like tell, that one person is getting more utility out of something than another. And Friedman, in a sort of folksy way with the grandchildren example, was just saying, come on, don't be ridiculous. And I know, and everybody knows that we make judgments about who's going to get like, and we could also just like, it would like, maybe to your point, this sounds like, creepy and instrumental. Like maybe we could just substitute happiness, right? It's like, we can, like we can know, of course we can know that like some people are going to get more joy out of something than another, like that would be, it would be impossible to go through life if you couldn't make judgments like that. I think that was Friedman's only point about that.
Well, I think that's, I think he's 100% right in that. It seems like Walter Block was trying to, so von Mises, they constantly push this economic calculation problem. And it's the idea that like without markets and without price signals, the central planners who are supposedly in charge of the economy can't make any judgments, about who is best to trust with various resources. And there's something to that point, but they tend to really overstate it, and they tend to try to apply it to absolutely everything. And yeah, it's just Walter Block is sitting there trying to apply it to David Friedman, and David Friedman, as he rightly points out, that no, we make these decisions every day. Like you can know, but okay, like take me for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Like I have I invested in a new iMac that has a ton of like really great editing software, and I did that because I'm doing a lot more on YouTube lately, and also I'm doing a lot more with my comics, and things are starting to move along. So I want to learn to do some of this stuff for myself when it comes to video editing and whatever. Now, if you only have a certain number of iMacs, you could give the iMac to me, or you could give it to someone who's already an expert in this. Clearly, the utility is going to come to the person who's not me, who like has learned how to use all of these tools. So obviously you don't need price signals, and I might be in a position to bid more than the person who actually knows how to use Final Cut Pro, for instance. And the price signal can even be wrong in that situation, and you might need a certain amount of central planning. So yeah, I think, it comes with like Walter Block is.
Sorry, I think I missed something. Can you say what you just said again?
Yeah. Well, I argued that, so I have a new iMac.
Yeah.
It's got Final Cut Pro.
Right.
I do not yet know how to use Final Cut Pro particularly well.
Right.
I want to learn to use it in the future.
Yeah.
Now, you could say that there's a central planner instead of a market system that's handing out iMacs. Mm-hmm. And trying to decide who has the higher utility. Obviously, an expert in Final Cut Pro who's been doing it for years, who knows how to use it, it's going to get more utility than me out of the iMac. But, there could be a situation where I have more money than the person who really who knows how to use it better. And so the price signal right there that I pay more for it doesn't necessarily reflect on the accuracy of like utility between me and this other hypothetical person.
Yeah. Okay. I think I've got you. I mean, I will just say really quickly, like this came up on my Colin show earlier tonight, and and my take on this is that as you say, there is something to the calculation argument. Which, by the way, what convinced, to the theme of tonight and last week's, debate, what convinces me of that this is not like, some a priori argument made by Ludwig von Mises or whatever. Like what convinces me of that is the actual like empirical record of what happened in, the 20th century, that, that the, like, there clearly was a problem with like, Soviet, grocery stores, that like does, that does seem to be best explained by something like this, right? Like, I think that's right. But the reason that distinction is so important, right? That I'm not like doing praxeology there, right? It's not that, like just pure thought, you never have to have seen a grocery store, like you never have to have looked at a statistic. You can just tell that this will be the case, that testing is relevant, is that, there's something to it, but there's a real hard limit to what there is to it. Like, because we also know from the empirical record that there are sectors where marketless state economic planning works extremely well. That I think the record is overwhelming that planning works way better than markets in healthcare, for example. And at least relative, at least if what you mean by works is like, supplies the relevant, like human goods, right? That
that it's
like,
efficient.
Yeah, I mean that they have that, like, if the goal of a healthcare system is that people will get the procedures that they need, the drugs that they need, and et cetera, right? Like I think that I mean, there are, like if you really want to do a Walter Block about this and like say, how are we going to cut up the categories and, like whatever, there's some games you could play here. And, you could say that America, which I know libertarians will always say that's not really free market healthcare, but whatever, it's like the most marketized, healthcare system in the developed world by far, right? Is, that like, yeah, I mean, if you're really rich, then like, it delivers those things way better than than any other system would. But like for most people, right, they're going to be way better off in a planned healthcare sector. And I also think there are good reasons to think on the level of some of the like commanding heights that we're talking about, like sort of infrastructure planning and things like that, right? That like, again, like I think what the calculation stuff applies best to is consumer goods, where what you really need is this very fine-grained matchup between production and like consumer preferences, and that's something that markets right now for I do hold the door open a crack to the possibility that future supercomputers will deliver us red plenty. But like, for now, I think you probably do need, some markets for some of that stuff. But the problem is that like, the problem with their version of it is that they are, all of them, right? Even the Chicago people who don't admit it, right? They're all doing praxeology, right? It's all like, oh, I've got these principles about how economies are supposed to work that tell me that
to make sure that it fits it. He even went back to it again, like that the guy kept finding evidence that was contrary to his principles. Therefore, the evidence must be wrong, not the principles.
Yeah, no, exactly. I should say, by the way, just to deliver my real-time fact check of myself, that I was going and looking at some relevant passages from the von Mises book, Human Action, and I guess I sort of want to walk back my thing about the free will element, but that's because, like, taking a quick glance at some of these passages now, I now realize that I can't tell what he's saying about free will. So, like, it's, there are definitely things that he says in there that make it sound like he doesn't really care that much about it. But, they're like, oh, yeah, environment, genetics, whatever. It's probably all stuff like that, But, like, there are also passages where he's making this, like, super duper sharp distinction between voluntary action and like, unconscious, processes. And it has a very, some of those passages have a very libertarian free willy feel to me, but like I think I was overstating the connection earlier.
Well, Okay, so this actually touches on something that I wanted to get to and forgot. Specifically, like with regard to the libertarian free will argument that you're hearing from von Mises. Now, von Mises and Rothbard both have the action axiom as their, von Mises. I do a takedown video of the action axiom. Using the philosophical zombie, actually, which is a fun video, guys. Go check it out. In that video, I talk about, because von Mises's definition of action is a little vague. Rothbard's is much more specific. It's a better definition, but because it's not as vague, it's also easier to attack. Rothbard contrasts purely reflexive action with intentional action, and comes to the conclusion that mankind acts. This is actually not something that you can really observe.
That sounds pretty libertarian free willy, that like if there's no, like if, mankind acts in this sense that, that like it doesn't count as an action if it's reflexive. And like that really seems like, if you allow for the conceptual possibility that stuff you think might not, might turn out to be wrong when you look at the evidence, like it seems like there's a lot in like modern psychology and cognitive science that would call that into doubt.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just like with the reflexive action, like with regard to neuroscience, like we know essentially that humans have basically two types of thinking. Scientists name them type 1 and type 2 because scientists are boring. But like the type 1 brain that people have, and there's a book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow.
Yep, Thinking Fast and Slow, yep.
Yeah.
Kahneman and, just Kahneman because Tversky was dead, yep.
Yeah, the essentially like the type 1 brain, you can understand it. And this is my version of webbed. Each of us, you can understand it like a Rolodex in our heads of pre-programmed stimulus and response. So the type 1 brain is the reason why like you can pull your hand away from a hot stove before you even consciously realize it's burning. Mm-hmm. It's also how like dancers and martial artists can get these very particular movements and routines in because they code it into their type 1. They make the card for that.
Right. System 1, I think.
Yeah, system 1. Then there's type 2 or system 2, which evolved later in humans. And this is what people really think of when they go like, and come to a conscious decision. The type 2 brain is, one isn't better than the other. The type 1 is much better for situations that you've encountered before and situations where you have to react quickly. It's also really good because it uses less energy. The type 2 brain doesn't work as well. It needs a greater amount of energy, so you're less likely to use it if you are hungry or tired. So like, throughout like your day, you're switching back and forth between type 1 and type 2 like an automatic shifter on a car. And Rothbard seems to think that he can look at a person and look at an action and decide that, well, that was type 1 and this other one is type 2. We only care about the type 2. We're going to follow that. But it's just not that simple.
Yeah, and to go to the relevance of this, right? I mean, like what the Kahneman stuff, and like all of those like Kahneman, Tversky, studies that are basically just like documenting the enormous number of like cases, where people have these weird, cognitive biases, because they're using, system 1, which, as you say, is better for tons of purposes, but like you sort of try to apply it to, like certain domains, you're going to get weird results, right? They had
the great example of that, by the way, the college psychology example. Okay, you have a baseball and a baseball bat.
Yeah.
Together, they're worth $1.10. The baseball bat is $1 more than the baseball. How much does the baseball cost?
Right.
Now, do you know the trick here? Do you know what the answer is?
Not off the top of my head, no.
So just about anybody that you ask that to,
we'll say 10 cents.
10 cents, and it's wrong. It's 5 cents.
Right, because the baseball and the right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
It changes based. It's a relationship between the two of them rather than just the just the raw numbers. But most people, when presented with that question,
110, 110, right? Yeah, like no. Yeah, for sure, right? So, and like what I was going to say is like, I mean, this helps inspire. I mean, there's this entire field, behavioral economics, that is that is about how, in fact, like, you know, if you're going to assume that you can model and predict economic behavior by thinking that everybody's, you know, like doing like system twoing and system twoing extremely well all the time, then like you're just going to get a lot of stuff wrong, right? Because like if, you know, like a whole lot of buying and selling behavior, you know, a whole lot of economic decision making just does not, you know, like in the possibly von Mises, and if von Mises is like too vague about it, because like is all this poetry about like action is the opposite of contentment and, you know, whatever, like, you know, like
my
Rothbard,
friend who's a professional economist, actually, he read von Mises a few years ago, and he's like, I don't think this guy is even an economist. He's more like a pundit.
yeah. So it's like he, you know, so like von Mises like is a little bit less clear. If Rothbard is at least admirably clear, and it sounds like that's what von Mises is saying, then like, okay, and this is like, rather than going on that whole rabbit hole about libertarian free will, like this is really where we should have started off here, because this is really the point, right? That they have that like, yeah, if man acts means man acts in the sense, you know, that like, you know, man is engaged in, you know, rational decision making, that it's like really should be like, well, man sometimes acts, but not really enough to make economic predictions that are like worth very much in many contexts, you know, like that's, you know, given that definition of acts.
Yeah, well, and also like it's I think it was Schopenhauer who said man can do what he likes, but not what he wills.
Yeah, he can do what he wills, but not, you know, will what he wills, something like that. Yeah. No, for sure, right? So I think that like.
Well, we'll hang on for just a second, Ben, because I have to use some human action to go use the little anarchists room. So I'm going to run off for a quick second, and then I'll be back.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. Let's see. There are a couple of chat things. Yes. Points to Ian for all zombies are philosophical because they love brains. I do. There's some back and forth in the chat about which, you know, about podcasters people don't like. I'm not going to touch that. I do want to respond to John about this, right? It says, you know, buying into the economic calculation problem helps the right. I think this is exactly the wrong way to try to figure out what's actually true, right? Like, basically, this is just like being like, the recommendation here is that we just be the communist version of Walter Block. That, you know, like Walter Block says, well, you know, the data, you know, doesn't line up with my assumption that rent control is always bad, because libertarian theory tells me that rent control is always going to have bad consequences. So I guess we must be making a mistake in trying to test with data the results of praxeology, right? I don't want to do communist praxeology. I think that, you know, you have to, if you care about trying to act on socialist values in the real world, then I think you have to look at a sober way at what actually happens. And if it's sometimes the case that what actually happens, you know, doesn't fit our theoretical preferences, then you shouldn't just do the, like, you know, see no evil, hear no evil thing. Like, you should say, all right, well, sadly, every once in a while, right, one in every 500 times, something happens that comes closer to our ideological enemies' predictions than our predictions. I don't think you should just refuse to admit that on principle. I think you should, you know, and I think you should say, well, okay, given the goals that I care about, how can I accommodate the fact that in this one particular case, right, you know, my enemies made a correct prediction about something. So yeah, I'm not this. I mean, just the idea that something is ideologically inconvenient to me, therefore I shouldn't believe it, is, again, this is how you become ultra block. Don't do that.
I just caught the end of that, but I definitely agree with you there, Ben.
Yeah, I am not at all arguing that leftists are obliged to oppose libertarian free will. Again, like, in some ways, this is the same question. Like, there is no such thing as a political obligation to have a view about any of this stuff. I mean, these are like, you know, once we figure out what's true about any of it, then we can ask,
Yeah.
like, okay, does this have some sort of consequences for my politics? But you shouldn't decide what you think is true based on what your political or ideological preferences are. That doesn't make any sense. Now, I do not, in fact, think that libertarian free will is plausible. Right? I don't think that we have that kind of free will. I think that I do. That doesn't mean that we don't have free will. It just doesn't mean that we have like the kind of free will that they think we have. But also, I don't think it's like, yeah. Could you believe in libertarian free will and still have all the same like political goals that I do, or all the same ideas about political strategy? Even sure, that's a separate question.
Yeah, absolutely. My answer to sort of the libertarian free will problem is I think it's asking the wrong question. Like with regard to libertarian free will versus determinism, the problem is not, it's how do you define yourself? Like if you listen to Alan Watts, he talks about this a lot. You can feel, if you define yourself only as yourself, as this localized center of consciousness, and we find out what we have about how the human brain works, and how, like, for instance, I think like the part of the brain that is responsible for action fires a little bit before the part of the brain that is responsible for choice. So it looks like what we're actually doing is just acting and then rationalizing it afterwards, even though we experience it both ways. The issue is that, you don't, as we talked about, like how big is the sun, you don't have to define yourself just as yourself, because that's not actually true. Like yourself is more or less your idea of yourself and that doesn't include any information like how you grow your hair, how you beat your heart. So already that idea of the self isn't real. And then you also realize that you can't really define what anything is unless you put that in relation to what it is not. So a good example of this is an ink drawing on a piece of paper. Our brain picks out the ink drawing, and we'd say like, oh, that black line is the drawing, but it's not just the black line. You need the white space for the drawing to occupy. Otherwise, the ink couldn't be on anything. So the actual drawing is not simply the lines that we pay attention to. It is the drawing and the paper together. It is the relationship between the two of those. And in much the same way, when it comes to my personal ideas about libertarian free will versus determinism, it becomes unintelligible, because the only way that we make sense in relation to our environment is by what is us and what is not the environment. And similarly, the environment either doesn't exist or might as well not exist if there were not an individual to experience it. So I think, like, ultimately, like, if we're a local center of consciousness making, type 2 brain choices at every step of the way, or if we're just being pushed around by, forces greater than we can imagine, I honestly think that that's the wrong question. And it comes from without getting too much into it, it comes from a type of common sense that the West has with regard to, like, our history as first, like, nations that rose out of Christianity and then the Enlightenment. And I think that common sense, just sort of like what Walter Block had talked about, like in the argument, where he was essentially using the continuum fallacy. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I think that ultimately, like, the reason he's falling into that is that there are assumptions that he has about the nature of reality that are incorrect. And I think you get into that with libertarian free will versus hard determinism when you make incorrect assumptions about reality, namely that the individual exists outside of the environment rather than individual and environment being a relationship between the two.
Yeah. A lot that can be said about it. I'll just quickly say that I think my I'm a compatibilist. I think that the kind of freedom or control that matters the most for most of the things that we care about, at least, is one that we would have regardless of what's true about determinism. I think that like the sort of John Martin Fisher ish view that what matters for most purposes that we care about is whether you're responsive to reasons in certain ways, that you can that you're capable of understanding and being at least somewhat moved by good reasons to do things or not to do things, is really what we're mostly concerned with when we're talking about people being in control of their actions or not. Like, what points of connection there might be between that and like normative political philosophy is a big question. Also, we did an episode with David Pizarro from Very Bad Wizards a while back that was like kind of all about this question. People could check that out. I will. Oh, also, I was the reason there was a really random point in what you just said that I kind of started laughing. That was because I was having flashbacks to debating Stuart Nechtel, because the thing about the ink, that he has this argument that he's very impressed with, that like if you're an atheist, you can't understand how blots of ink on paper can communicate information for some reason, and I've spent way too much time trying to figure out what he means by that, and I'm just coming up empty.
Well, I'm sorry I triggered you, Ben. By the way, I'm loving this comment. How would an ANCAP paradise deal with zombies? I'll tell you, from what I've noticed with COVID, I think most of them would run out and get themselves bit on purpose because they're convinced it's all fake.
Well, I was going to say that, right? That I have found it. I mean, in some ways it makes perfect sense, but I found it pretty remarkable in some ways in the last, 2 years. That's depressing. Okay, the last 2 years, that even the smartest and most thoughtful libertarians that I know have all to one extent or another become conspiracy theorists about COVID. And it's like, what the hell is going on here, right? Because aren't these guys I don't know, they have you think of a lot of libertarians, I don't know, they really like science, they have many moral and rational flaws, but that's usually not one of them. What's going on here? It's well, of course, because if you really admitted the scale of the crisis, then it would be really hard.
Your ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's oh, wait a second. This is that little very short debate that I had with Gavin McInnes where he it ended after 10 minutes because, to be fair, this is on me. I was controlling myself really well up until this point. But at the end of it, he at the end, what turned out to be the end of the debate, I asked him, do you really believe that with no government intervention at all, no shelter in place orders, when there's a vaccine, this was April 2020, when there's a vaccine, it'll just be sold for whatever price the market can bear. Do you really believe that not a single extra person would die in that world that wouldn't die in our world? And he said yes, at which point I'm only human. I couldn't stop myself from laughing. And he called me a smug cunt, I think, and hung up.
But I mean, he did that because he knew that you just crushed him, and he just
But that's the thing, because if you, and that's why, right? Because in April or whatever, even Gavin McInnes was kind of admitting how bad it was, right? But if you held on to that admission, okay, I mean, how if you admit that this is really bad, that the consequences of people spreading the virus are really bad, then man, what's the free market solution to this?
Yeah, there really is none. And in fact, you see that. Okay, so take for instance Vietnam versus Vietnam's had a difficult time with Delta. I'm sure they're having problems with Omicron right now. But the original wild type COVID, which sounds like a Pokemon, by the way, Vietnam only had like 35 deaths total in the entire country until like the Delta variant appeared. Now people will say, "Oh, well, Vietnam's a small country." No, it's not. It has the same population as 1/3 of the United States, and it is right next to China. It's not like an island or anything, and they were able to not only contain COVID and protect their people from it, they were also able to grow their economy all 4 quarters, which shows that, like, you know, Vietnam has had some capitalist reforms,
Sure.
but ultimately they have an economy that is, in my opinion, a socialist economy, or socialist enough that it is able, that as a country, they are able to act contrary to the laws of profit and loss. And in Vietnam, it was not a question of, do we save people or do we save the economy? They protected both, whereas we in the United States did neither. We crashed the economy, and what are we up to? 800,000 now dead.
Stuff like that,
Yeah. So like,
which like, of course, the libertarian conspiracy theorist response is yeah, but like a lot of them, you know, were fat or old or had diabetes, so like those don't count.
yeah, it's
which is just like delightfully insane, right? That it's like, yes, they have, like, you realize that everything you're listed off, people like remain alive while having these things for a very long time, right? That's like, yeah, you have like some kind of thing that's like a heightened risk, and then like, yeah, sure, like you're more likely to be the one who's picked off by the virus, but that doesn't mean you're just dying, you know, with COVID and not of COVID. You ridiculous person, you know, that they have, like, I mean, this is like, you know, I mean, yeah, you look at the excess mortality figures. I mean, it's just overwhelmingly clear that and especially because like 2020, right? It's like, okay, well, so many people spent so much extra time indoors. Like, all else being equal, you'd actually expect fewer people to die that year than in a normal year, and you have like way more people dying that year than like are even accounted for in the official COVID figures.
Well, and this honestly does this in a weird way. This actually dovetails right back to where we were talking about. Like, you brought up the point about the fact that you believe like a centralized, a central planner is better for the healthcare industry. That flies in the face of David's father, Milton Friedman, you know, who very famously argued that like profit was the only reason for a business to exist. It only existed to, you know, enrich the stockholders.
Yeah, and actually, there's like, it's like a moral argument that if you do anything like as a business, like if you do anything like that, you're directing the business, like, at least if it's a corporation, right? You're not the sole proprietor, you know, but like you're like a executive at a company who is appointed by a board of directors who are ultimately responsible to the stockholders. That if you do anything for any purpose that is not ultimately a profit-driven purpose, you know, then, you know, like if I mean, if I understand Milton Friedman's argument here correctly, like, you're the manager, and you decide that you're gonna like give everybody the day off, you know, on Christmas so they can spend the day with their families. Milton Friedman's argument is that you have done something immoral because you have betrayed the trust that the stockholders put in you, that they gave you their money for the purpose of you making them more money, and you making any decision that's in any other direction that, you know, that will result in them having less money is a betrayal of their trust.
Yeah, it's a horrifying way to look at the world, honestly. But yeah, so are we done with the debate now? I think they keep going. I don't think they move.
Okay, I'm not clear. We might be starting the Q&A, and we usually skip the Q&A on these, but like, also these two are so delightful. I'm pretty happy to spend a few more minutes in their presence. So I'm happy to watch at least a little bit of the Q&A and play it by ear.
Awesome. There's a short clip I saw that I'm hoping is coming up in the next couple of minutes.
Excellent. By the way, mods, if you wanted to just start like like doing like little, 5-minute bans for anybody who brings up like, you know, left media drama in the chat. I would not be unhappy about that. It's like, oh, do you like this person? Do you, did you hear about this egregious thing that other person did? I'm really happy to, I one of the primary goals of my life at this point is to spend less time hearing about that. So I'd be happy to see less of it in the chat. But let's go back and watch some of this.
The audience, and we'll pick some of them. Let's see.
Riveting. Come on, Guy, do something here.
Okay, so I'm going to start off with a question for Dr. Block, because this is kind of specific to what we're talking about. What are your thoughts on Rothbard's proposal for restoring the gold standard via gold revaluation?
Well, it's a very technical issue as to how to restore the gold standard. I think that's one reasonable way. Joe Salerno has done some work on that. I think the more important issue is not how to do it. That's a very narrow technical issue, but rather why we should do it. And why we should do it is as an insurance policy against the government. Right now, we've got inflation thanks to Joe Biden and his Fed. And we've had bouts of inflation before. Some people say that the reason Nazism came about is because of the hyperinflation of Germany in 1923. I'm not sure that that's right, but that's certainly a hypothesis, and I think it's plausible. So inflation is a very dangerous sort of a thing, and who's in charge of inflation? Well, central banking. And what's the alternative to central banking? Well, the alternative to central banking is free market money. And Milton Friedman is against this. The way David says it is, well, he really doesn't like the Fed because he claims the Fed created the Great Depression, which is true. In Milton's big book with David, what's her name? His co-author, I forget.
It's the Monetary History of the United States.
Yeah. What's his co-author? I forget her name.
I'm blocking two. I'm sorry.
Oh, boy.
Two of us
are pathetic, David.
Schwartz, Anna Schwartz.
Anna Schwartz, thanks. I want to give credit. And in that book, Milton did say that. But he also favored the 2% rule, and or the 2 or 3% rule. And, if you favor the 2 or 3% rule, you sort of have to favor the Fed a little bit. And I think that the Fed is a disaster. All government activity are problematic. And I think the gold standard is free market money. And the sooner we get back to the gold standard, or actually, I'm not in favor of the gold standard. It could be platinum. It could be silver. Who knows? I favor free market money. We usually mention gold because sort of as a shorthand, because whenever people were free to choose, they pretty much chose gold and sometimes silver. But we really don't favor the gold standard. We're not gold bugs. We're not like, what's his name, Scrooge McDuck, where you sort of run gold through your fingers or through your flappers or whatever ducks have. So I think it's very important that we go to a free market money as a protection against government.
Thank you. This is a case where Walter and I agree. That is to say, the appropriate solution is not to reestablish the gold standard. The appropriate solution is to legalize private banks issuing money. But that is going to include fractional reserve private banks issuing money, because that is, in fact, the observed market outcome. We've seen it in things Scottish. I should say, I don't know where he gets this idea that my father is somehow against that or against private money. My father, as I mentioned, has an article on the optimal behavior of the money supply, which is not his 2% rule. I once pointed out to him that in a simplified model of competing issuers, the equilibrium market result was precisely what his optimal rule was, and he agreed with me. You're sort of attacking invented opponents. My father analyzed the behavior of the Fed because the Fed existed. Our biggest difference, not disagreement, was that I was interested in the theoretical question of what you would get if you carried market principles all the way, and he was interested in the question, in the world as it is, how do you make things work better? And in the world as it is, the Fed exists, and so he was giving advice on what it should do. That's not an argument that you have to have the Fed, and nor, as far as I know, can you find any place where he said you have to have the Fed. That's your fantasy, or maybe Rothbard's fantasy. All right, next question.
All right.
Oh, that was great.
Awesome.
I love the comment at the end with him playing with the strings.
Yeah. Oh man, it's just so devastating. Yeah. So we had the chat comment earlier asking if we decided on the winner, and I mean, like, Friedman, right? Like there are a lot of times I don't even like to play the game of who won or who lost, whatever. But, like, you know, I think by any reasonable definition of winning, I mean that's got to be, you know, I mean it's the bar is not high right now, but I think Friedman's definitely winning.
This is one of the most one-sided debates I've ever seen in my entire life, to tell you. Like, I mean, just and Friedman was together. He was logical. He was able to, you know, make his points into a story that you could follow. And, you know, he didn't have so many incredibly embarrassing slip-ups. Like, he didn't go in and say, like, as Ben pointed out at the beginning, like, oh, I was trying to find evidence for my theory and I couldn't find evidence for my theory. So you must just never look for evidence because I know my theory's right a priori. It's like, oh, yeah. I mean, just hands down, you know, the Chicago school is kicking the crap out of the Austrians.
Yeah, because the Austrians admit that they're not in the business of evaluating beliefs by evidence, and the Chicagoans have some nominal residual belief, you know, that they don't practice very well, of, like, testing their beliefs with evidence, and that's, like, the core of what they're arguing about. It's like, yeah, that second one's obviously better, and also he's just doing a better job in the debate. You know, he's more on top of it, he's more organized, he certainly comes off as much more rational, and yeah, I think by every standard, although I do like Antonio's comment, which was, okay, you know, who won this debate? You know, can we talk about a winner or loser, which was Chile lost.
That is dark. I like it though. Chile is now eliminating the Pinochet like constitution.
Yes,
they
yes.
voted to undo that, which is
which I believe Pinochet actually named after something written by Hayek. That's but, like, I think that's right. But I will and yeah, there were both Chicago and Austrian, you know, footprints in Chile, you know, like Pinochet, you know, played both sides there, but I think at least he had very warm correspondence with Hayek, and I think I think he literally named the Constitution, you know, Constitution of Liberty, because that was Hayek's thing. But yeah, I think it is extremely dark, although also when this happened, we did a toast about it on the post game, and it makes me, like, the thought makes me extremely, like, normally, like, one of the main reasons that I don't believe that, you know, like, I can't accept that, like, a just God exists is that Henry Kissinger is still alive. But in this particular case, it makes me happy that Henry Kissinger is still alive. I mean, he could die now, right? You know, please. But like, I like that he lived long enough to see another socialist, you know, become president of Chile.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You know what was so weird about, like, so, like, the whole Chilean coup. Now, this didn't happen specifically with Pinochet, but one of the things that America did and I think you can read about this in the Jakarta Method,
Yeah.
which is a horrifying book, but it's a very important one, is that we took all of these, so we sold weapons to the Chilean military, but then we had to train the people to actually use the weapons. And thus you had the School of the Americas, which would take, I guess, officers from the Chilean military. It wasn't just Chile. It was a ton of South and Central American governments that we had sold these weapons to. We, over the course that they were taking these training sessions with the United States, they were given a slice of like the American dream in such a way that that had never actually existed within the United States. These officers observed a kind of plenty and a kind of presence of technology that really impressed upon them how superior the American way of life was, even though it was a lie. And the effect that this then went on to have with these particular officers was they developed an intense anger towards their own people, especially their own indigenous people, because they felt that these people were holding them back, that they were holding back the entire country from this form of, progress that they'd essentially been tricked into believing by the American State Department. And, it's not surprising that a lot of these governments in the South and Central America went on to commit atrocities against their own people, and especially against their own indigenous people, because, we kind of primed them to do that. So it's really horrifying. It's definitely something that just about every leftist should really, really look into. So read the Jakarta Method, and it's important to know this history. And that's another reason as to why it is so encouraging to see the Chileans throw off this horrible darkness that we partially imposed upon them.
Yeah, I went to a protest at the School of the Americas, or by then it had been renamed the much less creepy sounding Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation when I was in college. And, it was a strange thing in many ways, because there are people who are getting arrested in this way that's obviously at this point it's it's like an annual tradition. It's it's like, oh, this is my this is getting arrested at the School of the Americas Day, it's obvious, the protesters, the cops and whatever, they're all very comfortable with it. But one of the things that I really, that it really did hit home with for me, because I think this was shortly before the build up to the invasion of Iraq and very old, is that just walking around Fort Benning, marching up to the gates of the military base, where the School of the for the Americas is, it really makes you think about the absurdity of the oh, we're going to drop giant cluster bombs, but don't worry, only on military targets, because there are civilian homes right the hell up to literally the gate of the base, right? So it's hey, if somebody, some foreign power dropped a cluster bomb on this now, right? Spread, explosive material over the size of a football field. It's how much would it matter that there was a military target in the middle of that?
That's a really good point. It's so. What's your takeaway from this particular debate, Ben? Beyond, obviously, David D. Friedman obliterated Walter Block, but my big takeaway, I think it's, what I get out of this is that I think that Austrian economics is much crazier than Chicago school economics, but also in a way, I think Austrian economics is kind of much more self-aware than Chicago economics, because at least the Austrians kind of get that they're not
really molding a theory, based on like constantly looking at evidence and seeing if it fits and revising and all of that, right? I mean, they're sort of at peace with it. So in like some bizarre way, I kind of give them points for honesty, whereas like it seems like with Chicago, there's still this lingering pretense that they're doing that, which of course they're not. I mean, like this is, so we're at some point, Brent is going to come back and we're going to do this MMT Austrian economics debate.
That's really exciting.
Yeah. And like, I mean, I think like the least convincing versions of, MMT or classic Keynesianism or, like the kinds of ultra-Orthodox Marxism that say that like Karl Marx figured out all of economics in the 1860s and like, all you have to do is preach it, since then, like, I think in all cases, like, again, it's not that like there can't be, that there can't be aspects of, like a messy empirical reality that any of these theories latch onto. There can be. It's not even that there couldn't be one that like did a better job than any of the others. I'm totally open to that. But like, it just, if your primary way of navigating economics is like, here are a bunch of plausible sounding assumptions, which all of the above can give you, as can several others, right? Like then like, and I'm just going to sort of extrapolate, from that, like you're going to end up in some ridiculous places. And like, I mean, I just think like, it's, I think there's often like some tension about this because again, I like my economics a lot more when it acts like an empirical social science. And I don't, I'm like, whatever, like one of the, the co-authors of the book I'm writing, with Bhaskar Sankara, the unfeasible socialism called The Blueprint, because Bhaskar's a Jay-Z fan, is the other co-author, Mike Beggs, is, he's like a mainstream economics professor, kind of a Marxist neoclassical economist, right? But like he, so like, I'm not like, I mean, this is not some sort of like big, like global skepticism about all claims made by economists thing. But like, I just think like that I just think that like, you really like woe betide you if you forget that like, these are models that, that have, that like can be helpful in understanding things that go on. But like, you haven't like, like that's all they are, right? I mean, like, and so like the sort of Austrian thing just seems like that should be like the disturbing mirror for anybody who's acting like this to look into. That it's like if you've actually just like fully faced up to this, and and you just embraced it. You say, yes, damn it, there are synthetic a priori truths about economics, and we've discovered them. That's like, don't be that guy, right? Never go full Austrian.
Yeah. I mean, I had a similar takeaway. Again, I've been arguing with these people for nearly a decade now. So I've had a theory about Austrian economics for a while. And the first thing that I noticed was that you'll note that there are no Austrian economists who are employed as economists virtually. I mean, maybe there's one or two somewhere, but for the most part, like when a major financial firm is going to go out and hire an economist, they're not hiring Austrians. Instead, what's happening with the Austrians is that they are getting hired by political think tanks. So the von Mises Institute, the Cato Institute, that kind of thing. And even when they're in a position in universities to be teaching economics, it's really only like universities like George Mason, where like Charles Koch came in and gave them all of this money specifically to have them have Austrian economists teaching there. So I really think that the thing that Austrian economics does is not economics, but it is in the creation of political propaganda. And And there's a lot of weird stuff. If you look back at, there's a great essay you can find on Exiled online. It's webbed, called "Radicals, Imbeciles, and FBI Stooges." And I found it years ago after Occupy, because I'm like the last yippie from the Youth International Party. And it mentions the yippies. It breaks it down to like Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. I don't know how familiar the audience is, but everybody should look them up. There was a fracture between Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, in that Abby Hoffman was the revolutionary, and Jerry Rubin was very much kind of a proto-anarcho-capitalist. He went on a bunch of talk shows, and his big, like, famous quote was like, "Do it, just do whatever you want, and that's freedom." Whereas there was a real criticism of capitalism coming from Abby Hoffman. And, it's not, I don't think it's a coincidence. And in fact, it's not a coincidence because of Charles Koch's relationship with a guy by the name of Richard Fink, who really started the American Libertarian Party. It is not a coincidence that the libertarianism that is being sold by these people to America's youth, essentially, is convenient for oil billionaires. It's sort of like there's a process called recuperation, where it's something radical, a radical statement or a radical symbol is taken by the larger culture, devoured, and spit back out in like a form that is not dangerous to the culture. Great example of this would be Urban Outfitters putting out Che Guevara t-shirts. There's, and I think in a lot of ways, what anarcho-capitalism is, and what especially the Austrian school is it is recuperation of anarchist ideology, of like actual classical left anarchist thoughts and movements and statements. And I think that, like, Austrian economics, after watching this, seems even more empty than I had thought it was. And again, that's after arguing with these people for nearly a decade. Chicago School economics, I definitely disagree with a lot of their conclusions, but it seems to me like there's at least a certain amount of actual economics they are doing and talking about, as opposed to simply creating political propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess my possibly slightly unfair impression, but possibly slightly unfair, I do not think wholly inaccurate, is that, Chicago, like Chicago is kind of Austrian light, that's like you have, like you have a lot of the assumptions that the world that Austrianism has, and you're honestly, you are not very many steps removed from just like straight up doing praxeology, but like you have there's a certain amount of engagement there with actual economic data, and like a certain amount of attempt to like allow for, for like things to prove you wrong. And, you haven't completely ruled out, see above, this is one of the heresies that Bloch got mad at Friedman for, right? You haven't completely ruled out a priori the very possibility that, that there could ever be a market failure, so it's like the, it seems like Chicago is like, it's like the, well, we were talking about Princess Bride last week, right? It's like, there's a big difference between dead and almost dead, right? There's a big difference between, just like saying fuck it, we're not gonna like bother with like any we're not gonna bother with like subjecting our views to evidence. We're just gonna claim that these are synthetic a priori truths, and almost doing that, like that's actually a pretty large and significant difference. And it does mean, I think, that you could have a you could probably be frustrating, right? But like at least you could, if you're an economist who really disagrees with like David Friedman, you probably could have a little bit more of a conversation with him than you could have with Walter Block. Like remember, Card and Kruger, did that minimum wage study we were talking about last week. That there's a that the that the like predicted effects of this minimum wage increase in New Jersey about the unemployment, which, by the way, Walter Block kept saying, well, we could reason a priori that there's going to be more unemployment there would be otherwise, but it's untestable. It's like, no, it's not. Right? I mean, that's absolutely testable, right? Like, you could, if you're saying it's not a 100% pristinely perfect test, that's like, okay, no shit, nothing ever is, right? That's not like, there's always some kind of complicating factor or whatever, but like, that doesn't mean that you can't say the best explanation of the data is this or it's that, right? Like, and yeah, you can absolutely say, like, yeah, compare, adjoining counties, where this has happened and this hasn't happened. It's like the death penalty thing, right? That line that like a certain kind of death penalty apologist loves from whatever judge this was. I don't even remember, who said it, that said like, oh, well, we don't know how many ships are saved from shipwrecks by lighthouses, but that's no reason to tear down all the lighthouses. So, similarly, we don't know how many, murders are deterred by the death penalty. It's like, okay, but wait a second. If we tore down all the lighthouses on the East Coast, we didn't tear them down on the West Coast, pretty quickly, we would have a pretty good idea of how many shipwrecks they deter. And, you can compare the places that have like the death penalty to the places that don't have the death penalty. And similarly, you can compare like, fast food, again, assuming we get to talk about industries, despite, problems of ambiguity, right? Like the, fast food industry in like a county in New Jersey, where the minimum wage increase has gone into effect, in a county in Pennsylvania, literally next door where it hasn't. And, that can like, that does seem like, again, is it perfect evidence? Is like, does this allow for absolute certainty? No. But like, is that evidence? Yeah. Like, well, like it certainly, it certainly is. So this idea that whether if you implement some policy, you're going to get more unemployment than you otherwise would have, or you're going to get more inflation than you otherwise would have, or whatever. It's like, yeah, all of these things are testable. Like it's just a bizarre thing to claim that it's not testable. And at least, again, give David Friedman points for acknowledging that it is. And so he's like, yeah, like Card and Kruger, the people who did this minimum wage study, they think that our world, is closer than I think it is to the world where, the various background assumptions are such that minimum wage increases won't increase unemployment. I think they're wrong. Compare that to what Walter Black said about Card and Kruger, which was like, I think he stopped slightly short of calling for their execution, but I think he did say that they should like have their like economics degrees like retroactively stripped from them and, be banished from the profession or whatever. And because like they dared to say this, and, whereas Friedman's just like, yeah, I mean, I think they're wrong. I understand their argument.
Yeah, I have a friend on the right that referred to Walter Block essentially as an evangelist, and that seems to be correct, both in like his style of argumentation. It honestly kind of reminded me a little bit of Kent Hovind, and also like in the point where he kept coming back to not all Chicago school economists are in Chicago. Like everybody knows that. Like you don't have to say it even once, but he like came back and said it 2 or 3 times in the first thing. And then also on top of this, I think by the end of it, he probably knew he was getting trounced pretty hard. And so he seemed to be comparing, like when he said that Milton Friedman was in favor of the Fed, there were numerous points when he attacked David, on believing that a market failure could exist. He was essentially in each of those moments accusing David of heresy. And I don't know.
Yes, no, that is exactly what he was doing.
Yeah, and I mean,
he's a socialist.
He's a socialist
because he thinks market failures are possible, And so even though he doesn't actually support government intervention, he subscribes to an economic theory that could possibly be used to argue for some sort of limited form of government intervention.
Yeah. And so what he's essentially doing is he's playing on the biases of the audience. He knows these people are gold bugs. He knows they hate the Fed. He knows they hate minimum wage. So, his goal here was not to beat David Friedman. By the end of the debate, it was not to beat David Friedman on any of the points or any kind of logical argument. It was simply to reach out and appeal to the biases of the audience. Which, low marks for that. But I will say, at that point, I don't know what else he could have done because David just controlled this all the way through.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think like part of the reason why, again, in this case, I'm extremely comfortable using the winning losing language like that I do think Friedman unambiguously won is that it's like, okay, on the substance, what he was saying made more sense. And like, for all the reasons you've been saying, like what Block was doing wasn't like at a certain point wasn't even trying to really engage with him on that. Like, or he was spending at least as much time just trying to like point out all of the heretical things about Friedman's conclusions. But like also like superficially, like Friedman seemed to win too. I mean, I can't imagine like anybody who wasn't like 1,000% in Block's corner to start with coming out of that and like thinking that Block had done well, right? Because it's so obvious that like, yeah, I mean, graded by the curve of the general population, David Friedman is an extremely odd and ornery and eccentric old man. Graded by the curve of this conversation, he is like super calm and collected and together and all of that stuff, right? Like and he's giving like these well-organized I mean, other than the part I will say, like, points off for the part of the at the end of his opening presentation we talked about last time, where he just finished the presentation and kept talking, which is always a mistake, but like also specifically that he not only kept talking, but like he instead of like doing something that would somehow add to the argument, he just took out his notes about all the stuff that Murray Rothbard had gotten wrong in his books and like just started like doing it at random, right? So that was definitely a moment of Walter Blockishness on Friedman's part. But other than that, like Friedman is making these like well-organized presentations where he's engaging in very clear ways with Block's arguments, and Block is like just sort of, it's just this like kind of fountain like spouting off about all of his economic and philosophical views in this very randomly arranged way.
Yeah. I really think I'm the last person in the world that should be saying this, but to quote Shakespeare, brevity is the soul of wit. I really think like when you have fully made your point in a debate, you need to be okay with just to stop talking and let the other person talk or move on to the next thing, because I just feel it's better to stop at a point where you're really strong than to go out on a limb and try to score a couple more points. That I think was Friedman's biggest problem throughout this debate.
Yeah.
And I guess on that, should we end?
Yeah, no, I guess we should. Yeah, I think that's. Yeah, I'm just trying to think if there's any. Yeah, right. So we should take our advice and end probably. That's fair. Instead of just, I mean, I guess what I should really do is I should continue the stream for the next 20 minutes. But instead of talking about the debate, I should take out all of my notes about the things that David Friedman and Walter Block have gotten wrong in their books. And then whenever I do decide that we need to end the stream, I should web it by like just dumping the remaining pages into the chat for this live stream.
I'll tell you that the first part of the debate was just it was just glorious. So also guys, so if you got, and Ben, did I give you the link for my upcoming Kickstarter?
Yes. The link for Brent's Kickstarter is in the description for this video, as are all of his other links. So you can, and if you go to some of those links, you can see samples of his artwork. You can see descriptions of the project, and yeah, I think you should you should donate and help him do this.
Yeah, we right now I'm about in the next week to 2 weeks. I'm going to be launching a Kickstarter to pay for the creation of the very first trade paperback and hardcover for Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, my Ringo nominated series. Which, by the way, they're talking about the gold bugs. I have my gold coin here, which is one of the premiums you can get. And then also, I'm the author of Darude, Shadow of the People, which is right behind me here, a historical fiction biopic / war epic about the life of, in my opinion, one of the most interesting and admirable people in human history, Buenaventura Darude, who, if you're not familiar with him, he started out as a radical activist and union member of the Metal Workers Union, then became a sort of international fugitive, robbing banks and doing revolutionary activity across 5 countries and 2 continents, and then came back to Spain when Spain's military went fascist, took up the defense of Barcelona, and along with the rest of the CNT-FI, defeated the military, collectivized the entire city of Barcelona, and led an army of between 6,000 and 10,000 anarchists to Madrid to battle Franco. So it's a really cool story. I really hope that more people learn about him. And if you can, just go to the link, click notify me. And even if you don't intend to get the book or anything, the more people that are watching my Kickstarter when I launch, the better that algorithm will treat it. So I'd really appreciate that. And, if you want to subscribe to my channel, I'd appreciate that as well. Ben, do you need me to shout out your book again? Or do you want to do it?
Oh, I'm not going to stop you.
Yeah. Christopher Hitchens is somebody who's very important to me. I went through, like a lot of white guys, my new atheist phase back in like 2010 to 2012. And I even named my cat after Christopher Hitchens, and then eventually came to realize just how problematic he was, and how many of his arguments and rhetorical style, how limited it was. But also, he still got quite a bit right. So please get Ben's book. It's freaking phenomenal. I'm really excited I haven't finished it yet, but I'm really excited to get to the end here.
Yeah, it is really interesting how many leftists are running around with some sort of history like that. Like, we used this as the cold open a couple episodes ago, and I was on Left Reckoning. David Griscom told me that when he was 19, he was like standing outside the liquor store doing the classic thing, like trying to get somebody who's of age to to buy booze for him, and but every other teenager in the world was trying, who was doing that, was trying to get them to like buy beer or like maybe like vodka or something. David Griscom was trying to get someone to buy him Johnny Walker Black because it's what Christopher Hitchens drank.
He honestly, if you're interested in debate too, he had such a great style. He was like, I think even when I first started doing debates, I was like, I wanted to wear like a sweater and like kind of do my best Hitchens impression. Ironically, my first debate was with an ANCAP when I didn't know what ANCAPs were.
So is this a cat? Sorry, I missed it when you said this earlier. Is this a cat who's still with you, or is this a former cat?
No, my cat's still with me. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll have to see as he enters. As he how old is your cat?
I'm not entirely sure. So I got him as a kitten, though he wasn't a kitten, in must have been the winter of 2012, because it was I was out at a march with Occupy Wall Street. We had been kicked out of Zuccotti Park, and the police had arrested both a priest and Santa Claus as we tried to occupy a vacant lot a little where further down. And I broke off from the march, got out on Prince Street, and I told my wife, I had a girlfriend at the time, that I had a surprise for her. She said, "Are we getting a Prince?" And I said, "Yes." And when we walked into the store, Hitchens' original name was Prince. And the lady was like, I was going for the kittens, and they're like, "Hey, check out this cat." And I'm like, "Well, I really want a kitten." And they're like, "Oh, he is a kitten." And I'm like, "No, he's not." But they're like, no, this is the best cat in the world. And I'm like, I'll be the judge of that. I've lived with animals my whole life. I pick him up and I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is the best cat in the world. Didn't look at a single other one.
All right. Well, since doubtless Fuzzy Christopher Hitchens has several years left in him, it'll be interesting to see if if he follows the pattern, as somebody said in the chat. So like the first 3/4 of his life, he's a great cat, and then like in the last, he starts to get a little weird.
He may be moving on that. He's gained a lot of weight lately, so I got to take him to the vet. So he is following Christopher Hitchens.
Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, he's certain, somebody I have had very mixed feelings about for a very long time, which is one reason I thought it'd be good to revisit him now.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right before we leave, I wanted to shout out my friend's band, whose shirt I am wearing right now, the Dog Park Dissidents. People may know who they are. It is a punk queercore furry band that sings about like revolution, class struggle, and furries. But like, check them out; they're freaking amazing.
All right, interesting.
I went to his wedding. I actually attended a furry wedding, and it was one of maybe two of the most interesting weddings I've ever been to.
What was the other one?
The other one was a evangelical Christian / Lord of the Rings themed wedding, where they passed out like scrolls, and like all of the bride had like the Galadriel necklace, and all the men were dressed in like hobbit cloaks, but also they were like witnessing to us the entire time. And then the other one was I attended a wedding at the Bronx Zoo after dark, which was just perfect. Like we had the whole zoo to ourselves, and so I've been to some very weird weddings in my day. So it's those two and the furry wedding, where somebody came as a scientifically accurate velociraptor costume with like feathers on it instead of scales.
All right. Interesting.
If you've never seen a velociraptor dance at a wedding, you're missing out.
I have to admit, I have not. Wow.
Keep your cat away from the. Yes, I definitely.
Yeah, regularly pick up the water bowl and give it a little sniff to make sure. Yeah. All right. Well, this was fun. This is not a debate that would have ever occurred to me to watch, but I'm so glad I did.
Yeah, I'm glad you wanted to do it.
Yeah. Like I would. That never would have crossed my mind. Like, I don't know, even if I'd somehow, stumbled upon its existence on my own, I don't think it would have crossed my mind. But I'm so happy that I did. This was so delightfully strange, and straight through. And like, if you're only watching right now, you really do need to go back and watch part 1, because that like 5 minutes of like slapstick about how to use Zoom is just
Yeah, absolutely. I think this was the most entertaining debate that I've ever watched for that and a number of other things. And if you want to see, I guess, the Austrian school get taken down from their own with their own capitalist logic, It is pretty beautiful. So, all right. Well, I will catch you later, Ben. Thank you so much. I've got to go feed Hitchens. And yeah, can't wait to finish your book.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Brent.
Absolutely. Bye.
All right, guys. Just as a reminder, on Monday, we are going to have Naomi Caravani on as the main guest of the main show. Meanwhile, this weekend for GTA patrons, we are going to have a patron episode with Matt McManus, Russ Sabrigli, and Ryan Lake, doing a deep dive finally on that article claiming that Immanuel Kant was the source of wokeness. And next Thursday and the Thursday after, I am going to have a Victor Brazone and another friend on, and we are going to watch Destiny's debate with Richard Wolff. That one also feels like it's going to have to be harder. It's pretty long, but looking forward to it. And then the week after, so I'm assuming that's going to be next weekend. The week after that, we are going to have Nathan Robinson on, and we're going to watch the debate between Christopher Hitchens and William F. Buckley on Firing Line. So all good stuff coming up. If you like what we do and you support it, then like and subscribe, and please do consider becoming a patron. So that's patreon.com/Ben Burgis, and you are getting a bonus episode every week. You're getting a patron only post game every Monday night after the main show. You're getting access to the Discord. You're getting the Sopranos recaps with Nando and Waz and Mike Racine. And most importantly, it's not, these were all ways of saying thank you, but I mean, it's not about that, right? Most importantly, it's a gesture of solidarity. It's a way to help us to keep doing what we do. So if you like what we're doing, please do consider joining the Patreon. And otherwise, I will see everybody on Monday. Left is best.